A king, supposedly divinely appointed, apparently lost his mind and started attacking his own people. Or how an entire empire, vast beyond imagination, could rise from what seemed like nowhere. Or perhaps the peculiar fact that some of the greatest military minds in history faced their ultimate defeat, not on the battlefield, but at the hands of seemingly insurmountable logistics and the sheer tenacity of much smaller but fiercely independent city-states. These aren't just dry historical facts. They're the vibrant, sometimes bizarre, conversations the past has with us, if we only lean in close enough to listen. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And so, our story begins, not with a bang, but with the subtle rustlings of nomadic tribes traversing the vast sun-baked plains of what we now call Iran, long before anyone had even conceived of an empire that would stretch from the Aegean Sea to the Indus River, bringing disparate peoples under a single, unified, albeit sometimes iron, fist. These early inhabitants, the Medes and the Persians, were distant cousins, sharing common Indo-European roots, their languages twirling variations of an ancient tongue, their lives dictated by the rhythm of seasons and the search for fertile lands and grazing pastures for their livestock. They were hardy folk, accustomed to the stark beauty and harsh realities of the Iranian plateau, a land punctuated by towering mountain ranges that cradled hidden valleys and vast, often unforgiving deserts. For centuries, they lived in relative obscurity, a patchwork of tribal communities, sometimes allies, sometimes rivals, but always intrinsically linked to the land that shaped them. You could imagine them, huddled around flickering fires at night, swapping tales of brave warriors and clever hunters, perhaps occasionally grumbling about the latest raid from a neighboring clan, completely unaware that their descendants would one day command armies of hundreds of thousands and govern an empire of unprecedented scale. The Medes, being the slightly elder and perhaps more settled siblings, managed to establish a more centralized kingdom first, with their capital city of Ecbatana, modern-day Hamadan, growing into a formidable urban center, boasting impressive fortifications and royal palaces that would make a modern-day influencer blush with envy over the sheer opulence. They began to exert their influence over the surrounding tribes, including their Persian relatives to the south, who, while maintaining a degree of autonomy, increasingly found themselves within the Median sphere of influence. This was a relationship less of outright subjugation and more of a senior partnership, with the Medes often leading the charge in regional conflicts and setting the general geopolitical tone. The Median Empire, though perhaps not as widely remembered today as its successor, was a significant power in its own right, playing a crucial role in the downfall of the formidable Assyrian Empire, a truly brutal regime that had terrorized the Near East for centuries. Historians still argue whether the Median alliance with Babylon against Assyria was a carefully calculated strategic move or simply a shared desperation to rid themselves of a common cruel oppressor. Regardless, the fall of Nineveh, the Assyrian capital, was a monumental event, clearing the stage for new powers to emerge and marking a significant shift in the balance of power in the ancient world, a vacuum that would soon be filled by a force more organized, more expansive, and ultimately far more enduring. The Persians, nestled in the region of Parsa, modern Fars, were developing their own distinct identity, their tribal leaders honing skills in warfare and governance, perhaps observing the Median model with a keen, discerning eye. These weren't exactly sleepy shepherds, mind you. They were adept horsemen, skilled archers, and possessed a deeply ingrained sense of honor and loyalty. They worshipped a pantheon of deities, with Ahura Mazda, the wise lord, slowly emerging as a central figure in their religious practices, emphasizing truth, order, and righteousness, concepts that would later underpin the moral code of the empire. This early period, before the grand conquests, was a time of consolidation and internal development for the Persians, a slow burn of accumulating strength and organizational prowess under the leadership of a lineage of kings known as the Achaemenids. The name itself, derived from an ancestor named Achaemenes, would become synonymous with the empire's power and legacy for centuries to come, a name whispered in awe and sometimes fear across the ancient world. They were preparing, in their own quiet way, for a moment that would change everything. A moment when one remarkable individual would step forward from the shadows of tribal leadership and forge a destiny far grander than anyone could have imagined. The stage was set, the ancient Near East, a complex tapestry of emerging and declining powers. And it was into this intricate geopolitical dance that Cyrus the Great stepped, not with the bombast of an invading conqueror, but with a quiet, strategic brilliance that would redefine empire building. His story, as legend and history intertwine, begins with a certain dramatic flair, fitting for a man who would become one of history's most revered figures. Born into the Achaemenid royal house, he was, according to some tales, almost a forgotten prince. Perhaps even a figure born under ominous portents that led his grandfather, Astyages, the Median king, to order his death. Yet, as fate would have it, or perhaps due to the kindness of a shepherd and his wife, Cyrus survived, growing up in relative anonymity, honing his skills, and perhaps, just perhaps, feeling the stirrings of a destiny far grander than tending sheep. One can almost picture him, a young man, strong and clever, learning the ways of the land, observing the intricacies of human nature, all while the Median court, oblivious, continued its opulent existence. It was this very Median Empire, the dominant power that had long held sway over the Persians, that would be Cyrus's first great challenge and his first great triumph. The relationship between the Medes and Persians, while familial, had always carried an undercurrent of tension. The Persians, though respected warriors, were still largely subordinates. But Cyrus, with his burgeoning leadership and charisma, began to galvanize his people, whispering promises of autonomy and a greater destiny. The exact details of the uprising are debated by historians, but the prevailing narrative suggests that Cyrus led a revolt against his grandfather, Astyages. This wasn't a sudden, chaotic explosion, but rather a calculated move, likely fueled by Astyages' unpopularity among his own nobles and the growing discontent with Median rule. The Median army, perhaps less loyal to their aging king than to the idea of a stable region, might have even defected to Cyrus's side during the crucial battles, sensing the winds of change. It was a remarkably swift and relatively bloodless transfer of power, especially considering the brutal norms of the era. Imagine, one day you're part of the ruling empire, the next, your cousin is sitting on the throne having been welcomed by your own disgruntled generals. A real family drama, but on a truly epic scale. The overthrow of the Median Empire was more than just a change of guard. It was the pivotal moment that transformed the Persians from a subordinate kingdom into the dominant force in the region. Cyrus, unlike many conquerors before him, did not raise Ecbatana to the ground or enslave its population. Instead, he absorbed the Median administration, incorporating their nobles into his own court and respecting their customs. This act of calculated clemency was revolutionary for its time and would become a hallmark of Cyrus's reign. He understood that loyalty gained through respect and integration was far more enduring than loyalty enforced by fear alone. This wasn't just good PR. It was sound strategic thinking, building a stronger, more cohesive empire from the very outset. The Median capital, Ecbatana, became one of the Achaemenid Empire's royal residences, a testament to this policy of assimilation rather than destruction. With the Median kingdom now under his control, Cyrus turned his attention to the surrounding powers, each one a potential rival or a piece of the grand tapestry he envisioned. The first major target was the wealthy kingdom of Lydia, situated in Anatolia, a land renowned for its vast gold reserves and its legendary king, Croesus. Croesus, known for his immense wealth, we still use the phrase rich as Croesus today, was understandably nervous about the rapidly expanding Persian power. He sought alliances with other regional powers, including the Spartans, a decision that probably gave them a good chuckle back in Greece, thinking they could outmaneuver the rising Persian star. Croesus, after consulting the Oracle of Delphi, received a famously ambiguous prophecy. If he attacked Persia, a great empire would fall. Misinterpreting this as a guarantee of Persian defeat, he launched a preemptive strike, only to find that the empire destined to fall was his own. The ensuing conflict saw Cyrus employing innovative tactics, including, famously, using camels to disorient the Lydian cavalry, whose horses were apparently quite afraid of the unfamiliar beasts. Imagine being a proud Lydian cavalryman, charging confidently into battle, only for your valiant steed to suddenly decide it's had enough and bolts in terror at the sight of a grumpy camel. The Battle of Timbra was decisive, leading to the capture of Croesus and the fall of Sardis, the Lydian capital. Again, Cyrus showed his remarkable statesmanship. Instead of executing Croesus, as was the custom, he reportedly treated him with respect, even offering him a position as an advisor. This policy of clemency, of incorporating conquered rulers and populations rather than simply annihilating them, was a stark contrast to the brutal Assyrian methods and earned Cyrus a reputation for justice and mercy, even among his enemies. This was a king who understood that sometimes a golden cage was more effective than a bloody axe. With Lydia now absorbed into his burgeoning empire, Cyrus the Great turned his gaze eastward towards the formidable and ancient realm of Babylon, a city steeped in myth and power, renowned for its towering ziggurats and the legendary hanging gardens. The Neo-Babylonian Empire, under the rule of Nabonidus, was not merely a regional power. It was a cultural and economic colossus, a glittering jewel of Mesopotamia that had inherited the mantle of ancient empires before it. Babylon's walls were considered impregnable, its defenses legendary, and its influence stretched far and wide. Yet beneath this veneer of strength, internal dissent simmered. King Nabonidus had, perhaps unwisely, focused more on religious reforms and archaeological pursuits than on the day-to-day governance of his vast empire, often leaving the practical administration and the defense of the realm to his son, Belshazzar. This perceived neglect by the king, coupled with some unpopular religious policies that alienated the powerful Babylonian priesthood, created cracks in the empire's foundation, cracks that Cyrus, ever the shrewd observer of human nature and political dynamics, was quick to exploit. Cyrus didn't just march blindly into battle. He orchestrated a campaign that was as much psychological warfare as it was military might. He portrayed himself not as a foreign conqueror, but as a liberator, a restorer of traditional values, and a benevolent ruler who would bring peace and prosperity to the Babylonians. He actively courted the disaffected elements within Babylon, particularly the powerful priests of Marduk, the city's chief deity, who resented Nabonidus's perceived impiety. The Persian propaganda machine, if you will, was surprisingly effective, painting Cyrus as the chosen instrument of divine will, a far cry from the image of a destructive barbarian. Imagine the whispers spreading through the marketplaces of Babylon, tales of this Persian king who respected local gods and traditions, a stark contrast to the distant, seemingly aloof Nabonidus. It was a masterclass in soft power before the term was even invented, subtly undermining the enemy's resolve from within. The actual conquest of Babylon in 539 BCE is a story that has been told and retold, imbued with a certain poetic justice. Herodotus, among others, recounts how Cyrus's forces diverted the Euphrates River, which flowed directly through the city, lowering its water levels to the point where Persian soldiers could wade through the riverbed, entering the city through unguarded gates or sections of the wall weakened by the receding waters. The Babylonians, feeling secure behind their immense fortifications and perhaps caught off guard during a religious festival, were seemingly unaware until the Persians were already inside the city walls. This maneuver was a testament to Persian ingenuity and discipline, a daring feat of engineering and military execution. It's the kind of story that makes you think, seriously, how did they not notice the river drying up? But then, perhaps when you feel invincible, you stop looking for the obvious. The fall of Babylon was remarkably swift, and once again, largely bloodless within the city itself. Belshazzar, who was in command, was reportedly killed, but Nabonidus was captured and, in line with Cyrus's policy, treated leniently. The Cyrus cylinder, a remarkable clay artifact discovered in the ruins of Babylon, provides compelling evidence of Cyrus's approach. On this cylinder, Cyrus proclaims himself the legitimate successor to the Babylonian throne, chosen by Marduk himself, and declares his policy of returning deported peoples to their homes and restoring their religious cults. This was revolutionary. Instead of enslavement and destruction, there was restoration and respect. The exiled Jews held captive in Babylon for decades were among those who benefited from this policy, allowed to return to Judah and rebuild their temple in Jerusalem. This act, described in the biblical books of Ezra and Isaiah, earned Cyrus a unique place in Jewish history, revered as a divinely appointed deliverer. The capture of Babylon solidified Cyrus's control over all of Mesopotamia and extended Persian dominion into the Levant, granting the empire access to the lucrative trade routes and fertile lands of Syria and Phoenicia, and opening the door to Egypt. His empire now stretched from Anatolia in the west to the borders of India in the east, a truly unprecedented expanse for its time. It wasn't just the sheer size, however, that was remarkable. It was the way Cyrus governed this vast new realm. He established a system of satraps, or provincial governors, who were often members of the Persian nobility, but were expected to rule with a degree of autonomy while remaining loyal to the great king. This decentralized yet interconnected system allowed for effective administration over immense distances, a logistical marvel for the ancient world. Cyrus's reign established a template for imperial rule that would endure for centuries. His emphasis on religious tolerance, respect for local customs, and integration of conquered peoples into the imperial structure, rather than outright subjugation, fostered a degree of stability and loyalty that was rare in ancient empires. He was a conqueror, yes, but one who understood that lasting power came not just from the sword, but from the hearts and minds of the governed. His legacy was one of a just and merciful ruler, a figure of almost mythical stature, whose policies paved the way for a golden age of Persian power and influence. Historians still argue whether Cyrus's unique approach to conquest was born of genuine benevolence, or if it was a highly effective, pragmatic strategy to consolidate and maintain control over a diverse empire with minimal rebellion. Perhaps, like all great leaders, it was a subtle blend of both. The sudden and unexpected death of Cyrus the Great in 530 BCE, while campaigning on the empire's eastern frontier against nomadic tribes, cast a shadow of uncertainty over the vast dominion he had so painstakingly forged. Imagine the immense weight on the shoulders of his successor, Cambyses II, who inherited an empire of unprecedented scale and diversity, still in its relative infancy, and founded by a figure of almost legendary status. Cambyses, whose name in Persian means something akin to handsome king, faced the immediate challenge of proving himself worthy of his father's legacy, not just as a conqueror, but as a ruler capable of maintaining the intricate balance of power and loyalty that Cyrus had so masterfully established. He had to demonstrate strength, but also continue the strategic benevolence that had marked his father's reign, a tightrope walk for any young monarch. Cambyses' reign is most notably defined by his ambitious and ultimately successful conquest of Egypt, a campaign that had likely been planned by Cyrus himself, but was left to his son to execute. Egypt, with its ancient civilization, immense wealth, and strategic location, represented the last major independent power in the Near East. It was a tempting prize, promising not only vast resources, but also a significant boost to the Achaemenid Empire's prestige and dominance. The conquest wasn't a simple stroll through the desert. Egypt was a formidable kingdom, proud of its millennia-long history and its powerful pharaohs. The reigning pharaoh, Psamtik III, was the last of the Scythe dynasty, fiercely determined to protect his realm from foreign domination. The Persian invasion of Egypt was a meticulously planned operation, involving a massive logistical effort to transport a large army across the Sinai Desert, a notoriously difficult terrain that could break even the most determined military force. The Persians, ever resourceful, reportedly secured the assistance of Arab chieftains to ensure safe passage and supply lines, demonstrating their pragmatic approach to overcoming geographical challenges. The decisive clash came at the Battle of Pelusium in 525 BCE, a strategic fortress city on the eastern frontier of the Nile Delta. The battle itself, according to some ancient accounts, was a chaotic and bloody affair, one particularly gruesome and perhaps embellished. Tale suggests that Cambyses, knowing the Egyptians held cats as sacred animals, had his soldiers carry cats into battle, causing the Egyptian warriors to hesitate, fearing they might harm the revered felines. While this specific anecdote is likely a dramatic flourish, it speaks to the perception of Cambyses' cunning and willingness to exploit any advantage. The defeat at Pelusium shattered Egyptian resistance, opening the path to Memphis, the ancient capital. Psamtik III was captured, and Egypt formally became a satrapy of the Persian Empire. Cambyses initially followed his father's policy of respecting local customs and religions, adopting the title of pharaoh, and even participating in some traditional Egyptian religious rituals. This was a smart move, designed to appease the powerful Egyptian priesthood and integrate the new territory smoothly into the empire. He even established a Persian garrison on Elephantine Island, near the southern border, to control trade and secure the frontier. The conquest of Egypt was a monumental achievement, completing the Achaemenid Empire's expansion to its greatest territorial extent under its early kings, stretching now from the Nile to the Indus. It was, for all intents and purposes, the world's first true superpower, a fact that surely made other fledgling empires think twice about their dinner plans. However, Cambyses' rule in Egypt soon took a darker turn, or at least that's how later accounts, particularly those by the Greek historian Herodotus, portray it. Herodotus, who often relied on Egyptian sources that were perhaps keen to discredit their conquerors, paints a picture of a king who descended into madness, desecrating temples, mocking Egyptian gods, and even harming the sacred Apis bull, a living manifestation of the god Ptah. He's depicted as a cruel and capricious tyrant, prone to fits of rage, even allegedly executing his own sister wife. While it's important to approach these accounts with a critical eye, understanding that Greek perspectives were often hostile to their Persian rivals, there's likely a kernel of truth to the idea that Cambyses struggled with the complexities of governing such a distinct and ancient civilization. Perhaps the strain of command, the vastness of his inheritance, and the internal pressures of maintaining control over a truly enormous empire began to take their toll. Adding to the complexities of his reign were various military misadventures that failed to match the success of the Egyptian campaign. An expedition into Nubia, modern-day Sudan, to the south proved disastrous, with much of his army reportedly succumbing to the harsh desert conditions and lack of supplies. Another planned campaign against Carthage, a powerful Phoenician city-state, was aborted due to the refusal of his Phoenician fleet to attack their brethren. These setbacks, combined with the growing reports of his erratic behavior, began to chip away at his authority and the stability of the empire. Historians still argue whether Cambyses' reported madness was a genuine mental affliction, or if it was a convenient narrative constructed by later chroniclers to explain a period of unpopular rule and internal strife that followed his death, particularly as a justification for the subsequent usurpation of the throne. Whatever the true nature of his mental state, it's clear that something was amiss. As Cambyses was campaigning in Egypt, far from the imperial heartland, a seismic event occurred that would plunge the empire into chaos. a revolt led by a man claiming to be Bardia, Cambyses' brother, whom Cambyses had secretly ordered killed before his Egyptian expedition. This impostor, a Median magus named Gaumata, seized control of the throne, exploiting the existing discontent and the confusion surrounding Cambyses' whereabouts and reported actions. When Cambyses finally heard of the usurpation, he immediately began his journey back to Persia to confront the pretender. However, his return was cut short. According to various accounts, Cambyses died en route, either by accidentally wounding himself with his own sword, or from an illness, or even by suicide, though the exact circumstances remain shrouded in mystery and differing historical narratives. His death, sudden and far from home, left a power vacuum and a sprawling empire, teetering on the brink of widespread rebellion, setting the stage for one of the most tumultuous periods in early Persian history. The stage was now truly open for new contenders, each vying for the immense power of the Achaemenid throne. The death of Cambyses II, whether by accident, illness, or a more deliberate act, left the vast Persian Empire in a state of precarious instability, a testament to the fact that even the most meticulously built structures can crumble when their foundations are suddenly shaken. The vacuum created by his demise was swiftly filled by the audacious figure of Gaumata, the Median magus, who, with remarkable cunning, had successfully impersonated Bardia, Cambyses' younger brother. This wasn't merely a political maneuver. It was a grand deception, playing on the public sentiment for the Achaemenid royal line and exploiting the general uncertainty that rippled through the empire. Gaumata, capitalizing on Cambyses' long absence in Egypt and the prevailing rumors of his harshness or even madness, presented himself as the benevolent true heir, promising tax relief and military exemptions, policies designed to win immediate popular support, particularly among the common folk who had perhaps grown weary of constant warfare and heavy levies. This impostor's rise was a truly destabilizing force. The sheer scale of the deception and its initial success points to both the power of popular sentiment and the inherent difficulty of communication and verification across such a vast empire in the ancient world. News traveled slowly, and rumors like wildfire spread rapidly, filling the informational void. Gaumata's claim to the throne, as Bardia, was plausible enough to many, especially since the real Bardia had been secretly executed by Cambyses before his departure for Egypt, leaving no one to publicly contradict the impostor's story. For a time, it seemed that the Achaemenid dynasty, so recently established by Cyrus the Great, might be extinguished, replaced by a usurper who had no rightful claim to the throne. A real-life Game of Thrones where the stakes were literally everything. However, a secret, or at least a highly guarded truth, persisted among the inner circle of the Persian nobility. They knew the real Bardia was dead. 7 prominent Persian nobles, men of immense power and influence, whose loyalty to the true Achaemenid line ran deep, gathered in clandestine meetings, their whispers filled with a mixture of fear, outrage, and determination. They recognized the grave danger posed by Gaumata's deception, not just to the dynasty, but to the very fabric of the empire. They understood that if a commoner could so easily seize the throne through deceit, the system of inherited power, which was the bedrock of their society, would be irrevocably shattered. This group, led by Darius, a member of a cadet branch of the Achaemenid royal house, and a distant cousin to Cambyses and Bardia, decided that immediate and decisive action was necessary. The ensuing conspiracy to overthrow Gaumata is one of the most dramatic episodes in ancient history, recounted vividly in Darius's own monumental Behistun inscription, a trilingual carving on a cliff face that served as both a historical record and a potent piece of imperial propaganda. It details Darius's lineage, his divine right to rule, and, crucially, his heroic act of ridding the empire of the lying one. The conspirators, with careful planning and extraordinary bravery, infiltrated the fortress where Gaumata was residing, launching a swift and brutal assault. The impostor was caught off guard, and along with his followers was slain, bringing an end to his brief deceptive reign. It was a risky gamble, a daring coup d'etat that could have easily gone wrong, leading to their own execution. But their success paved the way for a new chapter in Persian history, one defined by order and unparalleled expansion. The death of Gaumata, however, did not immediately usher in an era of peace and stability. Quite the opposite. The empire, already reeling from the previous upheaval, exploded into a series of widespread revolts, a veritable cascade of rebellions across almost every satrapy. Each region, sensing weakness at the center, saw an opportunity to assert its independence or claim the throne for a local leader. Elam, Babylonia, Media, Parthia, Armenia, Assyria, even Egypt, all rose up in defiance against the nascent authority of Darius. Imagine trying to manage a social media feed with that many simultaneous crises, let alone a vast empire without modern communication. It was a true test of leadership, a trial by fire for the man who would become Darius the Great. Darius, with the support of his fellow conspirators, now found himself facing a monumental task: to reclaim and reunify an empire that seemed intent on tearing itself apart. He spent the better part of the next 2 years, from 522 to 520 BC, engaged in a relentless campaign to suppress these rebellions. This was not a single grand battle, but a series of grueling military engagements, often fought simultaneously on multiple fronts. Darius personally led his armies, demonstrating remarkable military acumen and unwavering resolve. He faced down multiple pretenders, each claiming royal lineage or popular support, each challenging his legitimacy. The Behistun inscription meticulously chronicles these campaigns, naming the rebels, the locations of the battles, and the brutal efficiency with which Darius crushed each uprising. It's a gripping narrative of a king literally fighting for his right to rule, proving his strength through sheer force of will and strategic might. The suppression of these revolts was brutal but effective. Darius understood that mercy, in this context, could be perceived as weakness. His punishments for the rebel leaders were severe, often involving impalement or other public executions designed to serve as stark warnings to any who might consider defying imperial authority. While this might seem harsh to modern sensibilities, it was a common and effective deterrent in the ancient world. Through these arduous campaigns, Darius not only re-established central authority, but also consolidated his own position as the legitimate ruler, a powerful and decisive monarch who had, seemingly against all odds, saved the empire from fragmentation. He had inherited a crown in chaos, and through sheer grit and strategic brilliance, had hammered it back into a powerful symbol of unified rule, setting the stage for one of the most impactful and enduring periods in the history of the Persian Empire. having brutally and effectively reasserted control over a fractured empire. Darius thus embarked on a transformative era that would solidify the Achaemenid domain into an administrative marvel, a bureaucratic behemoth unlike anything the ancient world had ever witnessed. His genius lay not just in military conquest, but in recognizing that a sprawling, multi-ethnic empire required more than just brute force to endure. It needed a sophisticated, centralized system of governance that could effectively collect taxes, administer justice, maintain order, and foster economic prosperity across vast distances. This was Darius's true legacy, turning a collection of conquered territories into a cohesive, functioning imperium, setting a gold standard for imperial administration that many future empires would attempt to emulate, often with far less success. You could say he was the ancient world's greatest CEO, but with way more swords. The cornerstone of Darius's administrative reforms was the refinement and expansion of the satrapy system. Cyrus had introduced the concept, but Darius meticulously structured it, dividing the empire into approximately 20 large provinces, each governed by a satrap. These satraps were typically high-ranking Persian nobles, chosen for their loyalty and administrative capabilities. Their primary responsibilities were to maintain law and order, collect taxes, and raise troops for the imperial army. However, Darius, ever the pragmatist, understood the dangers of granting too much unchecked power to a single individual, no matter how loyal. To prevent any satrap from becoming too powerful or ambitious, he implemented a clever system of checks and balances. Alongside the satrap, there was a military commander, directly answerable to the king, controlling the provincial garrisons. Then there was a royal secretary, often referred to as the king's eye or king's ear, who reported directly to the central court on the satrap's activities, essentially acting as an internal auditor and intelligence officer. Imagine trying to pull a fast one with 3 different bosses all watching you. To further ensure loyalty and efficient communication, Darius established a magnificent network of roads, the most famous of which was the Royal Road, stretching over 1,600 miles from Susa, one of the Persian capitals, to Sardis in Lydia. This wasn't just a dusty trail. It was a well-maintained, purpose-built highway, complete with relay stations spaced at regular intervals, where fresh horses and riders were kept ready. This postal service, the ancient world's equivalent of express delivery, allowed royal messages and intelligence to travel with astonishing speed, enabling the king to respond swiftly to any crisis or rebellion. Imagine a message traveling from the westernmost reaches of the empire to the heartland in just 7 days, a truly revolutionary speed for its time, making modern postal services look positively sluggish. This road network wasn't just for royal dispatches. It facilitated trade, troop movements, and the general flow of goods and people, knitting the vast empire closer together. Beyond infrastructure, Darius recognized the critical importance of a stable and consistent economy. He standardized the empire's currency, introducing the daric, a high-purity gold coin, and the shekel, a silver coin. This standardized coinage facilitated trade both within the empire and with neighboring states, simplifying transactions and boosting economic activity. No more haggling over the purity of various metals. A daric was a daric, universally recognized and accepted across the vast Achaemenid domain. This move significantly streamlined tax collection, making it more predictable and efficient, allowing the central treasury to accumulate immense wealth. It also fostered a sense of unity and shared economic purpose across diverse regions. Furthermore, Darius implemented a more equitable and systematic tax collection system. Rather than arbitrary levies, each satrapy was assessed a fixed annual tribute, paid in gold, silver, or goods, based on its economic capacity. The systematic approach, meticulously recorded, replaced the often haphazard and exploitative methods of previous empires. While still a burden, the predictability and fairness of the system likely reduced resentment and encouraged productivity, as local populations knew exactly what was expected of them. This stability allowed for large-scale public works projects, including the construction of magnificent new capitals like Persepolis, a city designed to embody the grandeur and power of the Persian Empire. Historians still argue whether the monumental scale of Persepolis was primarily a symbol of overwhelming power or a genuine attempt to create a shared imperial identity among diverse peoples. The Achaemenid legal system also saw significant reforms under Darius, while allowing local laws and customs to largely remain in place. Darius sought to establish a universal framework of justice based on the principles of Asha, truth and order, a core tenet of Zoroastrianism, the emerging state religion. He compiled and codified existing laws and legal traditions, aiming for greater consistency and fairness across the empire. This commitment to justice and order, frequently emphasized in royal inscriptions, was intended to project an image of a benevolent and righteous ruler, furthering the concept that the Persian Empire was a force for good in the world, bringing peace and stability to previously chaotic regions. The reign of Darius I, often considered the zenith of the Achaemenid Empire, was a period of immense prosperity, stability, and cultural flourishing. His administrative innovations provided the strong backbone that allowed the empire to endure for another 2 centuries, shaping its character and enabling its continued dominance. He took the sprawling conquests of Cyrus and Cambyses and transformed them into a well-oiled machine, demonstrating that true power lay not just in wielding a sword, but in designing a spreadsheet and building a road. The administrative blueprint he laid down was so effective that elements of it can be seen reflected in later empires, a quiet testament to his foresight and organizational genius. Having established an administrative system that was the envy of the ancient world, Darius I now found his meticulously ordered empire facing its greatest external challenge: the fiercely independent, often fractious, but ultimately tenacious city-states of Greece. This wasn't a sudden clash. It was the culmination of escalating tensions, misunderstandings, and perceived affronts that had been simmering for decades. The vast, centralized, and hierarchical Persian Empire, with its concept of a universal monarch, was about to collide with a decentralized world of self-governing poleis, fiercely protective of their freedom. A clash of ideologies as much as armies. Imagine a highly efficient corporate multinational trying to negotiate with a bunch of fiercely independent, slightly eccentric local businesses. Things were bound to get messy. The roots of the conflict lay in the Ionian Revolt, which erupted in 499 BCE. The Greek cities of Ionia, located on the western coast of Anatolia, had been brought under Persian control during Cyrus's conquests. While generally enjoying a degree of autonomy under their satraps, Resentment simmered over tribute payments, the imposition of pro-Persian tyrants, and a general yearning for the self-governance enjoyed by their mainland cousins. Led by Aristagoras of Miletus, the Ionian Greeks rose in rebellion, seeking aid from the Greek mainland. While most cities declined to help, two prominent ones, Athens and Eretria, sent a small contingent of ships and troops. This act, though seemingly minor, was a monumental miscalculation. The Athenian and Eretrian forces, alongside the Ionians, managed to sack Sardis, the former Lydian capital, and a significant Persian administrative center. Although they were eventually driven back and the rebellion ultimately crushed by 493 BCE, Darius saw the burning of Sardis as an unforgivable insult, a direct challenge to his imperial authority. He reportedly vowed revenge, instructing a servant to remind him 3 times daily, "Master, remember the Athenians." This was less about conquering Greece and more about punishing insolence and deterring future rebellions within his own vast dominion. The first Persian punitive expedition against mainland Greece was launched in 492 BCE under the command of Darius's son-in-law, Mardonius. This initial attempt focused on subjugating Thrace and Macedon, bringing them fully into the Persian sphere, and establishing a secure supply route along the northern Aegean. While largely successful in its immediate goals, disaster struck when a large part of the Persian fleet was wrecked in a storm off Mount Athos, a devastating blow that forced Mardonius to retreat. This maritime catastrophe highlighted the inherent difficulties of naval operations in the Aegean and gave the Greeks a temporary reprieve, perhaps leading some to believe their gods were on their side. Undeterred, Darius planned a second, more direct assault on Athens and Eretria. In 490 BCE, a massive Persian fleet, reportedly comprising hundreds of ships, sailed directly across the Aegean Sea, bypassing the treacherous northern route. This expedition was led by Datis and Artaphernes, 2 experienced Persian commanders. They swiftly captured Naxos and Eretria, exacting a harsh punishment on the latter, enslaving its inhabitants and burning its temples in retaliation for the burning of Sardis. The next target was Athens, the primary instigator of the Ionian support. The Persian forces landed on the plains of Marathon, a coastal plain approximately 25 miles northeast of Athens, strategically chosen for its flat terrain, ideal for deploying the Persian cavalry and vast infantry formations. The Athenians, knowing they were vastly outnumbered, sent a desperate plea for help to Sparta, their powerful military rival. However, due to religious observances, the Carnea festival, the Spartans stated they could not march until the moon was full, a delay that would prove critical. The Athenian forces, commanded by Miltiades, a general with prior experience fighting the Persians in Ionia, found themselves facing the Persian juggernaut, largely alone, though they were joined by a small contingent of Plataeans, loyal allies. It was a classic underdog scenario, the small citizen soldier army of Athens against the professional imperial might of Persia. The Battle of Marathon, fought in September 490 BCE, was a moment that would forever be etched into the annals of Western history. The Athenian strategy was bold and unexpected. Instead of allowing the Persians to deploy their cavalry in the open plain, the Athenians advanced at a run, minimizing the time their hoplites were exposed to Persian archer fire. Miltiades also thinned his center to strengthen his wings, a seemingly counterintuitive tactic. When the two armies clashed, The Persian center, composed of their elite immortals, initially pushed back the Athenian center. However, the strengthened Athenian wings enveloped the Persian flanks, turning the tide of battle. The heavily armored Greek hoplites, fighting in their disciplined phalanx formation, proved devastating against the lighter armored Persian infantry. The battle was a resounding victory for the Athenians, a shocking upset that sent the Persian army reeling back to their ships. The casualty count was heavily skewed, with thousands of Persian dead compared to a mere 192 Athenians, whose fallen were buried on the battlefield in a communal mound. It was a miracle for the Greeks, a humbling defeat for the Persians, and a moment that inspired an entire civilization. The victory at Marathon was not just a military triumph. It was a profound psychological boost for the Greeks. It demonstrated that the seemingly invincible Persian colossus could be defeated, and it instilled a fierce sense of pride and unity, particularly in Athens, whose democratic ideals seemed to have been vindicated against the imperial autocracy. For Darius, it was a frustrating setback, an unexpected hiccup in his grand design. He immediately began planning an even larger invasion to avenge this insult and finally subjugate Greece. But fate intervened. Before he could launch his massive new expedition, a revolt erupted in Egypt, and shortly thereafter, in 486 BCE, Darius I died. His grand plan of revenge and conquest would fall to his son, Xerxes I, who would inherit not only the largest empire the world had ever seen, but also the unfinished business of his father's bruised pride. The weight of his father's unfinished business, coupled with the immense legacy of Cyrus the Great, fell squarely upon the shoulders of Xerxes I. Inheriting a vast and meticulously organized empire, Xerxes was a man born to the purple, trained for leadership, and instilled with the understanding that the Achaemenid Empire was destined to be the paramount power of the world. The defeat at Marathon, though militarily minor in the grand scheme of Persian power, was a symbolic stain on the empire's honor, an affront that demanded a monumental response. Xerxes, after successfully suppressing the Egyptian revolt that had diverted his father's attention, dedicated years to planning and preparing an invasion of Greece on a scale previously unimaginable, an endeavor that would truly test the logistical capabilities of his vast empire and the resolve of the disparate Greek city-states. This wasn't just another punitive expedition. It was a total commitment of imperial resources, a grand statement of Persian might designed to utterly crush Greek resistance and bring the entirety of the known world under Achaemenid sway. Xerxes amassed an army and navy of staggering proportions, drawing contingents from every corner of his empire. Medes, Lydians, Egyptians, Assyrians, Indians, Arabs, Ethiopians, and countless others, each bringing their unique fighting styles and equipment to the grand parade. Ancient sources, though often exaggerated, speak of numbers so vast they drank rivers dry and darkened the sky with their arrows. While modern historians debate the exact figures, it is clear that Xerxes' force was by far the largest military expedition ever assembled up to that point, a logistical marvel that still boggles the mind. Imagine trying to feed and water that many people, let alone coordinate their movements across foreign lands. The engineering feats undertaken by the Persians for this invasion were truly astonishing. To avoid the disastrous shipwreck that had plagued Mardonius's fleet off Mount Athos in 492 BCE, Xerxes ordered the construction of a canal through the Arthos Peninsula, a monumental undertaking that took 3 years and employed thousands of laborers. It was an audacious display of power, effectively demonstrating that nature itself would bend to the will of the great king. Then, to bridge the Hellespont, modern-day Dardanelles, the narrow strait separating Asia from Europe, 2 massive pontoon bridges were constructed, anchored by hundreds of triremes and reinforced with thick ropes made of flax and papyrus. These bridges, capable of supporting the passage of the entire army, were themselves symbols of Persian engineering, prowess, and determination. It was as if Xerxes was saying, "If you won't come to us, we'll build a highway right to your doorstep, across the sea." In the spring of 480 BCE, Xerxes personally led his colossal army across the Hellespont, marching through Thrace and Macedon, finally entering Greece. The sheer scale of the invading force sent shockwaves through the fragmented Greek city-states. Many smaller states, recognizing the overwhelming power, medized, offering earth and water as symbols of submission to the great king. However, a core group of Greek cities, led by Athens and Sparta, resolved to resist. They formed the Hellenic League, an unprecedented alliance, and strategized to defend their homeland. Their plan was to hold the Persians at 2 key choke points: the narrow mountain pass of Thermopylae on land, and the equally narrow straits of Artemision at sea. The Battle of Thermopylae is perhaps the most famous stand in ancient military history, a testament to courage against impossible odds. A small force of Greek hoplites, estimated at around 7,000, including the legendary 300 Spartans led by their king Leonidas, chose to defend the narrow pass. The Spartans, renowned for their rigorous military training and unwavering discipline, understood that this was a suicidal mission designed to delay the Persian advance, allowing the rest of Greece more time to prepare and mobilize. For 2 days, the Spartan-led forces held the pass against repeated waves of Persian attacks, inflicting heavy casualties on Xerxes' army, whose superior numbers were rendered largely ineffective in the confined space. Imagine the frustration of the Persian commanders, throwing wave after wave of their finest soldiers against a seemingly unbreakable wall of shields and spears. However, the heroic stand was ultimately betrayed. A local Malian Greek, Ephialtes, revealed a secret mountain path that allowed Persian immortals, led by Hydarnes, to outflank the Greek position. Upon learning of the betrayal, Leonidas famously dismissed most of his allied troops, choosing to remain with his 300 Spartans, along with a contingent of Thespians and Thebans, to fight to the last man. Their sacrifice was absolute. They fought until every last man fell, creating a legend that echoed through the ages, a powerful symbol of defiance against tyranny. The stand at Thermopylae, though a tactical defeat, was a colossal moral victory for the Greeks, demonstrating their fierce commitment to freedom and inflicting a psychological blow on the seemingly unstoppable Persian advance. Concurrently with the land battle, a series of naval engagements occurred in the nearby straits of Artemision. The Greek fleet, though outnumbered by the Persian armada, managed to hold its own over 3 days of fierce fighting. While the battles were largely indecisive, they prevented the Persian fleet from outflanking the Greek land forces and kept the Greek navy intact, buying crucial time. A fierce storm also struck the Persian fleet during this period, causing significant damage and further leveling the playing field. The strategic importance of Artemision was immense. It was the first major naval confrontation of the war, showcasing the superior maneuverability of the lighter Greek triremes against the larger but less agile Persian ships. Despite the heroism at Thermopylae and Artemision, the immediate consequence was that central Greece lay open to Xerxes. Athens was evacuated, its citizens fleeing to the island of Salamis and the Peloponnese, as the Persian army marched south, burning and pillaging cities, including the sacred city of Athens itself, whose temples on the Acropolis were famously sacked and destroyed. The stage was now set for the ultimate naval confrontation, a battle that would determine the fate of Greece and perhaps the course of Western civilization. With Athens ablaze and much of mainland Greece seemingly at the mercy of the vast Persian war machine, the fate of the Hellenic world hung by the thinnest of threads. The sacrifice at Thermopylae had bought precious time, but it had not stopped the inevitable advance. The Persian army, having swept through Boeotia, now occupied Attica, and the sight of the smoke rising from the Acropolis was a chilling testament to their overwhelming power. The remaining Greek forces, particularly the Athenian citizens and their navy, had evacuated to the island of Salamis, a narrow strait between the island and the mainland, while the Peloponnesian forces concentrated on building a defensive wall across the Isthmus of Corinth. The Greek commanders were at a crossroads. Some argued for a defensive stand at the Isthmus, effectively abandoning the islands and northern Greece, while others, primarily the Athenian general Themistocles, passionately argued for a decisive naval engagement in the cramped waters of Salamis. Themistocles, a shrewd and visionary leader, understood that the sheer size of the Persian fleet, though an advantage in open waters, would become a crippling liability in the narrow confines of the Salamis Strait. He employed a brilliant ruse, sending a slave to Xerxes with a false message, claiming that the Greek fleet was about to flee, and that if the Persians attacked quickly, they could trap and destroy it. Xerxes, perhaps overconfident after his land victories and eager for a swift, decisive end to the war, fell for the bait. He ordered his vast fleet, estimated to be well over 600 ships, to block both entrances to the strait, preparing for what he believed would be an easy victory. He even had a throne set up on Mount Aigaleo, overlooking the straits, so he could personally witness the annihilation of the Greek navy, a decision that would prove to be a front-row seat to his own strategic miscalculation. The Battle of Salamis, fought in September 480 BCE, was a naval masterpiece, a testament to tactical genius overcoming numerical superiority. As the Persian ships, predominantly large cumbersome vessels, moved into the narrow waters, they quickly became disorganized, their sheer numbers working against them. Their maneuverability was severely hampered, leading to collisions and chaos. The lighter, more agile Greek triremes, powered by highly trained rowers and manned by disciplined hoplite marines, were perfectly suited for the confined space. They rammed Persian vessels with devastating efficiency, shearing off oars, holding hulls, and creating a chaotic melee. The Greeks knew the waters intimately, their coordinated maneuvers slicing through the confused Persian ranks. The battle raged for hours, a swirling maelstrom of splintered wood, snapped oars, and desperate cries. Persian commanders found it impossible to coordinate their vast fleet, while the Greeks, fighting as a cohesive unit, exploited every advantage. By the end of the day, the Persian fleet had suffered a catastrophic defeat, losing hundreds of ships and thousands of men. It was a crushing blow, not just militarily, but psychologically. Xerxes, from his perch on the mountain, watched in horror as his magnificent navy was systematically dismantled. His dream of conquering Greece through overwhelming naval power was shattered. Themistocles' gamble had paid off spectacularly, securing a victory that was nothing short of miraculous for the Greeks and preventing the encirclement of the Peloponnese. Historians still argue whether the Persian commanders were simply outmaneuvered by Themistocles, or if internal rivalries and a lack of unified command within the diverse Persian fleet also contributed significantly to their disarray and defeat. With his navy severely crippled and his supply lines across the Aegean now vulnerable, Xerxes made the momentous decision to retreat with a significant portion of his army back to Asia, leaving behind a substantial land force under the command of his trusted general, Mardonius, to continue the conquest in the spring. This decision reflected the fundamental logistical realities of ancient warfare. Without naval supremacy, supporting such a massive army far from home was simply unsustainable. The retreat of Xerxes was itself a monumental undertaking, fraught with hardship and loss, highlighting the immense difficulties of moving vast numbers of people and animals across unforgiving terrain. Mardonius, however, was still left with a formidable army, and he spent the winter of 479 BCE in Thessaly, attempting to sow discord among the Greek allies and consolidate his position. He even tried to tempt Athens back to the Persian side with generous offers of autonomy and rebuilding their city. But the Athenians, buoyed by their recent victory and fiercely committed to their independence, refused. The final showdown on land came in 479 BCE at the Battle of Plataea in Boeotia. The combined Greek forces, a pan-Hellenic army representing over 24 city-states, including a large contingent of Spartans, Athenians, and Corinthians, united under the command of the Spartan regent Pausanias. The battle was a protracted affair, with initial skirmishes and maneuvering across the plains of Plataea. After several days of stalemate, a Greek withdrawal to a more defensible position was misinterpreted by Mardonius as a full retreat. He ordered a general advance, leading to a massive engagement. The Greek hoplites once again demonstrated their superior discipline, heavier armor, and the devastating effectiveness of the phalanx formation. The battle was fierce and bloody, but the Greek forces, fighting for their homes and their freedom, ultimately overwhelmed the Persian lines. Mardonius himself was killed in the thick of the fighting, a critical blow to Persian morale and leadership. The rout was complete. The remaining Persian forces were utterly defeated, their camps sacked, and the threat of Persian land invasion effectively ended. On the very same day as Plataea, according to tradition, another crucial battle took place at Mycale, on the coast of Ionia. The remaining Greek fleet, having pursued the crippled Persian navy, found it beached and fortified by a Persian land army. The Greeks landed their marines, stormed the Persian camp, and destroyed the last significant remnants of Xerxes' grand armada and land forces in the Aegean. This double victory at Plataea and Mycale decisively ended Xerxes' invasion. The great king had been humiliated, his vast resources expended, and his grand ambition thwarted by a coalition of determined Greek city-states. The Persian Empire, though still immense and powerful, would never again launch such a direct, large-scale invasion of mainland Greece, and the strategic initiative in the Aegean would shift firmly into Greek hands. The era of Persian expansion into Europe was, for all intents and purposes, over. The crushing defeats at Salamis and Plataea, coupled with the final blow at Mycale, marked a definitive turning point in the relationship between the Persian Empire and the Greek world. While Persia remained an undeniable superpower, its aura of invincibility had been severely dented, and the initiative in the Aegean had decisively swung in favor of the victorious Greek city-states, particularly Athens. This wasn't the end of Persian influence, far from it, but rather a shift in the nature of their engagement. The era of grand, direct invasions of mainland Greece was over, replaced by a more nuanced, often insidious, strategy of diplomacy, proxy wars, and financial manipulation, a testament to Persian adaptability and their enduring, if now more subtle, power. It was less about brute force and more about playing the long game, a sophisticated chess match where the pieces were Greek city-states. Immediately following the Persian retreat, the Greeks, invigorated by their victories, went on the offensive. The Athenians, under the leadership of Themistocles and later Cimon, began rebuilding their city and fortifying the Piraeus, their port, with impressive long walls, much to the chagrin of the Spartans, who viewed such fortifications with suspicion. More significantly, Athens formed the Delian League in 478 BCE, ostensibly a defensive alliance against future Persian aggression, but quickly transforming into a powerful Athenian-controlled empire. Its stated goal was to free the Greeks still under Persian rule in Ionia and the Aegean, and to extract compensation for the damage inflicted by the Persian Wars. This shift marked the beginning of Athenian imperial ambition and set the stage for future conflicts, not just with Persia, but with their former allies, particularly Sparta. For several decades, from the 470s to the 450s BCE, there was a period of intermittent conflict, often referred to as the Delian League Wars against Persia. The Athenian-led league actively campaigned in the Aegean, liberating Ionian cities, raiding Persian territories, and challenging Persian naval supremacy. A significant victory came at the Battle of the Eurymedon River around 496 BCE, where the Athenian general Cimon achieved a double victory, destroying a large Persian fleet and defeating a land army on the same day. This further pushed Persian influence back from the Aegean coast and secured the freedom of many Greek cities. This was a direct challenge to Persian authority, a clear signal that the status quo had fundamentally changed, and that the Greeks were now a force to be reckoned with, not just in defense, but in offense. However, the Persian Empire was not easily brought to its knees. Despite these setbacks, its vast resources remained largely intact. Rather than risking another monumental, costly invasion, the Persian kings, including Artaxerxes Tismati, who ascended the throne in 465 BCE, adopted a more pragmatic approach. They understood the internal divisions among the Greeks, particularly the growing rivalry between Athens and Sparta. The Persian strategy evolved into one of funding and supporting various Greek factions, playing them against each other, ensuring that no single Greek power could become strong enough to pose a unified threat to the empire. It was a classic divide and conquer strategy, but with gold rather than swords as the primary weapon. This policy became particularly evident during the Peloponnesian War, 431-404 BCE, the devastating conflict between Athens and Sparta and their respective allies. The Persian Empire, far from being a passive observer, became an active, if indirect, participant. They provided substantial financial subsidies to Sparta, recognizing that Athens, with its strong navy and growing imperial ambitions, posed a more immediate threat to Persian interests in the Aegean. Spartan ambassadors routinely visited the Persian court at Susa, negotiating for gold to build their fleets and pay their mercenaries. It was a bizarre inversion of roles. The Greeks, who had fought so valiantly against Persian invasion, were now accepting Persian gold to fight each other. One can almost hear a Persian satrap chuckling, "Let them exhaust themselves. We'll pick up the pieces later." This Persian financial intervention was crucial, particularly in the later stages of the Peloponnesian War, enabling Sparta to finally challenge and eventually defeat the Athenian navy, which had long been its strength. The famous Treaty of Antalcidas, also known as the King's Peace, signed in 387 BCE, perfectly encapsulated this shift in power dynamics. This peace treaty, dictated by Artaxerxes II and enforced by Persian power, essentially made the great king the arbiter of Greek affairs. It stipulated that all Greek cities in Asia Minor were to remain under Persian rule, while the mainland Greek cities were to be autonomous, with the exception of Lemnos, Imbros, and Syros, which would remain Athenian possessions. The treaty was a humiliating blow to Greek pride, a clear acknowledgement of Persia's continued geopolitical dominance and its ability to impose its will on the free Greeks, not through military conquest, but through diplomatic leverage and financial might. Historians still argue whether this period represents a triumph of Persian diplomacy or a tragic failure of Greek unity, demonstrating their inability to set aside their petty rivalries for a common good. Even after the Peloponnesian War and the King's Peace, Persian influence remained pervasive in Greek politics. Persian gold continued to flow, supporting various factions, mercenaries, and political figures. Greek mercenaries, in turn, frequently found employment in the Persian army, a lucrative career path for seasoned hoplites who had no wars to fight at home. This mutual dependency further blurred the lines between enemy and ally, creating a complex web of alliances and betrayals. The Persian Empire, despite its earlier military setbacks against the Greeks, had successfully pivoted to a strategy that ensured its continued regional dominance and prevented the emergence of a unified Greek power that could challenge its vast borders. They had learned from their failures, adapting their approach from direct confrontation to a more subtle, yet equally effective, form of imperial control. Following the grand dramas of the Persian Wars and the shifting diplomatic landscape marked by the King's Peace, the Achaemenid Empire entered a period often characterized by a succession of relatively less prominent kings, yet a period crucial for understanding the empire's internal dynamics and its continued interactions with the wider world. From the death of Artaxerxes III in 424 BCE to the ascension of Darius II and beyond, the vast Persian machinery continued to grind forward, maintaining its grip on an immense and diverse population, even as the names of its rulers might not resonate with the same thunder as Cyrus or Darius the Great. It was a time of consolidation, of internal challenges, and of subtle power plays, both within the imperial court and on its vast frontiers. You could say it was the imperial equivalent of a long-sustained hum, rather than a roaring crescendo. The reign of Artaxerxes III Longimanus, meaning long-handed, which spanned from 465 to 424 BCE, was largely a period of peace and stability within the empire, particularly after the final cessation of hostilities with Greece following the Peace of Calais. Though this treaty's existence is still debated by scholars, its principles largely reflect the reality of the era. Artaxerxes thus focused on internal administration, maintaining the satrapy system, and overseeing continued prosperity. He was known for his generally conciliatory approach, and it was during his reign that the biblical figure of Nehemiah, a Jewish official in the Persian court, was granted permission to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem, showcasing the empire's continued policy of religious tolerance and support for local traditions, a policy that dated back to Cyrus the Great. This demonstrated that even while actively involved in Greek affairs, the Persian heartland remained focused on its own unique internal structures. However, the death of Artaxerxes plunged the court into a brief but intense period of instability, a common vulnerability in monarchies without clear succession protocols. A series of short, contested reigns followed. First, his son Xerxes II held the throne for a mere 45 days before being murdered by his half-brother Sogdianus. Sogdianus himself ruled for only 6 months before being overthrown and executed by yet another half-brother, Ochus, who would then take the throne as Darius II. This rapid succession of assassinations and usurpations highlights the fierce internal power struggles that could erupt within the Persian court, particularly among the numerous sons of the great king, each vying for the ultimate prize. It was less a stately procession and more a deadly game of musical chairs for the crown. Darius II, Nothus, the bastard, who reigned from 423 to 404 BCE, came to power through these turbulent means and spent much of his reign suppressing various revolts, both internal and external, that had flared up during the instability. One significant challenge was a rebellion in Media, which had long been a close ally and integral part of the empire. This required considerable military effort to quell, demonstrating that even long-established relationships could fray under stress. Darius II also faced an uprising in Lydia and continued unrest in Egypt, which, despite having been reconquered by Cambyses, proved to be a perennially difficult province for the Persians to fully control. The sheer scale of the empire meant that there was almost always some distant satrapy or region stirring up trouble, like an ancient version of whack-a-mole for the imperial administration. Despite these internal challenges, it was during Darius II's reign that Persian influence in Greek affairs reached new heights, primarily through financial diplomacy during the latter half of the Peloponnesian War. Recall how Persian gold played a pivotal role in enabling Sparta to build its navy and ultimately defeat Athens. Darius II skillfully exploited the internecine conflicts of the Greeks, pouring vast sums of money into Sparta's coffers, always with the understanding that Persian interests in Ionia and the Aegean would be respected. This strategic use of wealth, rather than direct military intervention, proved to be highly effective. The Persian satraps in Asia Minor, particularly Tissaphernes and Pharnabazus, became key players in Greek politics, holding court with ambassadors and military commanders from both sides of the conflict, acting as power brokers and dispensing the king's vast treasury to influence events. One could argue they became the world's first major foreign aid donors, with strings attached, of course. The internal stability of the Persian Empire during these reigns, while punctuated by succession crises and regional revolts, was largely maintained by the enduring strength of the administrative system established by Darius I, the satrapies, the royal road, the standardized currency. These underlying structures continued to function, ensuring the flow of tribute and information to the central court. The vast imperial army, comprised of contingents from across the empire, remained a formidable deterrent, capable of suppressing most serious threats. The Persian kings, even those less celebrated, understood the importance of maintaining this complex machinery, ensuring the continued prosperity and power of the Achaemenid state. This period also saw the continued cultural blending and influence that was a hallmark of the Persian Empire. While Persian culture and the Zoroastrian religion remained dominant, the empire was a melting pot of diverse peoples, languages, and traditions. Aramaic served as the lingua franca of the administration, allowing for communication across vast distances. Artisans from Egypt, Greece, Mesopotamia, and India contributed to the unique syncretic style of Persian art and architecture, visible in the magnificent palaces of Persepolis and Susa. This cultural exchange wasn't just a byproduct of empire. It was actively fostered, contributing to the empire's intellectual and artistic vibrancy. This wasn't just about conquering. It was about connecting, albeit under Persian rule. By the end of Darius II's reign, the Persian Empire, despite its occasional internal squabbles and the ongoing Greek entanglement, remained the dominant power in the Near East. Its borders were largely secure, its economy robust, and its influence far-reaching. However, the seeds of future internal conflict, particularly regarding succession and the ambition of various royal princes, were constantly being sown, ready to sprout into dangerous challenges. The stability of the empire, as always, ultimately rested on the strength and legitimacy of its monarch, and the next succession would unleash a conflict far more dramatic and personally devastating than any seen since the rise of Darius the Great. The fragile peace that had settled over the Persian court following the succession struggles after Artaxerxes I was dramatically shattered by one of the most compelling and personally tragic conflicts in Achaemenid history, the rebellion of Cyrus the Younger against his elder brother, Artaxerxes II. This wasn't merely a regional revolt. It was a bitter, fratricidal struggle for the throne, illuminating the inherent dangers of power concentrated in a single family and the potent ambition that could drive even the closest kin to violence. It's the kind of story that would make even the most hardened reality TV producer gasp. Artaxerxes, Mnemon the Mindful, ascended the throne in 404 BCE, inheriting an empire that was vast but still prone to internal tensions and the lurking specter of dynastic dispute. His younger brother, Cyrus, had been appointed satrap of Lydia, Phrygia, and Cappadocia, giving him immense power and control over the significant Persian forces stationed in Asia Minor, crucial for managing relations with the Greek city-states. Cyrus, a man of considerable military talent and charisma, harbored a deep-seated resentment, believing that he, not Artaxerxes, was the rightful heir to the throne. He felt he was the stronger, more capable leader, and perhaps that his claim was stronger, given some historical ambiguities. This ambition, simmering beneath the surface, was actively fueled by Greek contacts, particularly Spartan commanders who had benefited from Cyrus's generous subsidies during the Peloponnesian War and saw him as a more reliable and pro-Greek ally than his brother. For several years, Cyrus the Younger meticulously plotted his rebellion, secretly amassing a substantial mercenary army, primarily composed of Greek hoplites, renowned for their discipline and fighting prowess. These Greek mercenaries, numbering around 10,000 and immortalized as the 10,000 in Xenophon's Anabasis, were a critical component of Cyrus's force. They were promised generous pay and the prospect of adventure, eager to escape the economic hardships that followed the Peloponnesian War in Greece. Cyrus, a master of deception and subterfuge, managed to conceal his true intentions from the imperial court for a surprisingly long time, claiming his preparations were for a campaign against rebellious local tribes. He was essentially telling his brother, "Don't worry, just a little spring cleaning in the neighborhood." In 401 BCE, Cyrus finally launched his audacious bid for the throne. He marched his army, a mix of loyal Persian troops and his Greek mercenaries, eastward from Sardis, deep into the heart of the Persian Empire. The true objective, the overthrow of Artaxerxes and the seizure of the throne, became horrifyingly clear to the Greek mercenaries only as they approached the Euphrates River, far from the coastal regions they were accustomed to. Despite their apprehension and a mutiny that almost derailed the expedition, Cyrus managed to persuade them to continue, appealing to their honor and promising even greater rewards. The decisive confrontation occurred at the Battle of Cunaxa, near Babylon, in September 401 BCE. Artaxerxes II had managed to assemble a much larger imperial army, drawing forces from across his vast domain, including his elite immortals. The battle was a chaotic and desperate affair. The Greek mercenaries on Cyrus's right flank proved overwhelmingly effective, easily routing the Persian left wing that opposed them. It was a testament to the tactical superiority of the heavily armed and disciplined Greek phalanx when faced with the lighter armored Persian infantry. One can only imagine the shock on the faces of the Persian soldiers as these disciplined blocks of men simply marched through their lines. However, the tide of battle turned dramatically in the center. Cyrus, eager to achieve a swift and decisive victory, personally charged towards his brother, Artaxerxes, hoping to kill him and immediately claim the throne. In the ensuing melee, Cyrus engaged in hand-to-hand combat, displaying immense bravery and skill. He managed to wound Artaxerxes, but ultimately, Cyrus himself was struck down and killed. The death of Cyrus the Younger was the turning point. With their leader dead, his Persian forces quickly disintegrated, their morale shattered. The Greek mercenaries, victorious on their flank, were left stranded in the heart of a hostile empire, thousands of miles from home, completely surrounded by a now triumphant and vengeful imperial army. The aftermath of Cunaxa was particularly brutal for the Greek mercenaries. Lured into a false sense of security by promises of safe passage, their senior commanders were treacherously murdered by the Persian satrap Tissaphernes. It was a harsh lesson in ancient diplomacy. Never trust a treaty negotiated after you've just tried to overthrow the king. The remaining 10,000, now leaderless and deep within enemy territory, faced a perilous journey. Their epic retreat, meticulously chronicled by Xenophon, one of their own commanders, in his Anabasis, the March Up Country, became a legendary tale of endurance, courage, and resourcefulness. They fought their way through hostile tribes, treacherous mountains, and bitter cold, eventually reaching the Black Sea and ultimately returning to Greece. The March of the 10,000 became a powerful narrative for the Greeks, demonstrating the vulnerability of the vast Persian Empire to a small, well-disciplined force, sowing the seeds of future ambitions. For Artaxerxes II, the victory at Cunaxa solidified his position on the throne, ending the most significant challenge to his rule. However, the rebellion had revealed cracks in the empire's facade. The fact that a powerful satrap, aided by foreign mercenaries, could march so deep into the heartland and come so close to overthrowing the great king was a worrying precedent. The need for constant vigilance against ambitious regional governors and the allure of foreign mercenaries became a persistent concern for the imperial court. The betrayal by Tissaphernes of the Greek generals while securing a short-term advantage also eroded trust, making future diplomatic efforts with Greek mercenary leaders far more challenging. The consequences of Cyrus the Younger's rebellion would linger, shaping Persian foreign policy and internal security concerns for decades to come, reminding everyone that even within the most powerful families, ambition could be a lethal force. With the specter of Cyrus the Younger's rebellion firmly laid to rest, Artaxerxes II Menemon secured his throne, embarking on one of the longest reigns in Achaemenid history, spanning from 404 to 358 BCE. His nearly half-century on the throne was less about grand conquest and more about the complex art of maintaining control over a vast and diverse empire, a feat that required immense diplomatic skill, strategic military deployments, and an unwavering commitment to the intricate dance of international relations, especially with the ever-present, ever-quarrelsome Greek city-states. One could say he was the ultimate master of ancient geopolitical chess, always thinking several moves ahead. The aftermath of Cunaxa had a profound impact on Persian foreign policy. The experience of Cyrus the Younger hiring a formidable mercenary army and their subsequent successful retreat through the heart of the empire demonstrated both the effectiveness of Greek hoplites and the potential vulnerability of Persian internal security. Consequently, Artaxerxes II and his satraps became increasingly adept at utilizing Greek mercenaries for their own purposes, often hiring thousands of them to bolster imperial forces, especially in regions prone to rebellion or along contested borders. This was a pragmatic acknowledgement of Greek military prowess, transforming potential threats into valuable assets. It was also a clever way to keep the most dangerous Greek warriors occupied and paid, thereby preventing them from becoming a nuisance on Persia's borders. The primary focus of Artaxerxes II's diplomacy remained the Greek world, a complex and ever-shifting kaleidoscope of alliances and rivalries. The Peloponnesian War had ended just as his reign began, with Sparta emerging as the dominant power, largely thanks to Persian gold. However, Spartan hegemony soon proved unpopular among other Greek cities, leading to new conflicts. Artaxerxes skillfully navigated these shifting alliances, leveraging Persian wealth and diplomatic pressure to maintain a balance of power that prevented any single Greek state from becoming too strong. He understood that a fractured Greece was a safe Greece from a Persian perspective. If you can't beat them, pay them to fight each other, right? The most significant diplomatic achievement of Artaxerxes II's reign was undoubtedly the King's Peace of 387 BCE, sometimes dated to 386 BCE, which we touched upon earlier. This wasn't merely a treaty, it was a Persian diktat, a peace dictated by the great king and accepted, however begrudgingly, by the squabbling Greek states. The terms were clear. All Greek cities in Asia Minor, Ionia, were to remain under Persian rule. a clear affirmation of Persian sovereignty over this crucial region. The mainland Greek cities, on the other hand, were to be autonomous, with the explicit understanding that Persia would guarantee this autonomy, essentially making Artaxerxes the arbiter and enforcer of peace in Greece. This arrangement formally ended the long series of Greek wars and cemented Persia's role as the supreme diplomatic power in the Aegean. It was a remarkable diplomatic coup, securing Persian interests without the need for military invasion. However, the king's peace didn't usher in an era of absolute tranquility for the Persian Empire. Artaxerxes II faced continuous challenges on his vast frontiers. Egypt, as always, remained a thorny problem. Despite repeated Persian attempts to reconquer the rebellious province, led by powerful Greek mercenary commanders, Egypt managed to maintain its independence throughout much of Artaxerxes II's reign. This was a significant strategic frustration for the Persians, as Egypt's wealth and resources were immense, and its independence encouraged other rebellious tendencies within the empire. It was like having a particularly stubborn hangnail that just wouldn't go away. Moreover, the empire faced the satraps' revolt in the western provinces, particularly Asia Minor, beginning around 366 BCE. Several powerful satraps, including Datames, satrap of Cappadocia, and Ariobarzanes, satrap of Phrygia, joined forces in a widespread rebellion against central authority. This was a serious threat, as these satraps commanded considerable resources and their own military forces, and they often received support from opportunistic Greek city-states like Sparta and Athens, who saw a chance to weaken Persia's grip. Artaxerxes II had to deploy significant military resources and rely on shrewd diplomacy, often exploiting rivalries among the rebellious satraps themselves, to gradually suppress these uprisings. It took years of sustained effort to bring these powerful regional governors back into line, showcasing the persistent tension between centralized imperial power and ambitious provincial rulers. Despite these challenges, Artaxerxes II maintained the administrative structures established by Darius III, ensuring the continued flow of tribute and the effective governance of his vast domains. The empire's wealth, generated from its diverse provinces and lucrative trade routes, remained immense, allowing Artaxerxes to fund his military campaigns, maintain his elaborate court, and crucially, continue his diplomatic interventions in Greece. The Persian court at Susa and Persepolis remained centers of power and cultural exchange, drawing scholars, artists, and diplomats from across the known world. Artaxerxes II's long reign, while lacking the dramatic conquests of his predecessors, was a period of sustained imperial power and influence. He demonstrated the enduring strength of the Achaemenid system and the ability of a skilled ruler to manage a complex geopolitical landscape through a combination of military deterrence, financial leverage, and astute diplomacy. He navigated a world where Greek mercenaries were both a threat and an asset, where powerful satraps had to be kept in check, and where the empire's vastness was both its strength and its vulnerability. His reign effectively prolonged the Achaemenid Empire's dominance in the Near East for another half-century, postponing the inevitable collision with the rising power in Macedon, a storm brewing on the horizon that even the most skillful diplomat could not entirely foresee or prevent. The long reign of Artaxerxes II, while characterized by diplomatic maneuvering and the suppression of numerous revolts, eventually gave way to another period of succession struggle, culminating in the ascension of Artaxerxes III, Ocus. This new king, who ruled from 358 to 338 BCE, was a stark contrast to his father, where Artaxerxes II often preferred diplomacy and subtle manipulation. Artaxerxes III was a king of ruthless efficiency, fierce determination, and a willingness to employ brutal force to reassert absolute central control over an empire that had grown somewhat complacent and fragmented during his father's later years. He was the kind of monarch who understood that sometimes, to make an omelette, you really do have to break a few hundred eggs, preferably with a very large hammer. Artaxerxes III inherited an empire still grappling with the aftermath of the satraps' revolt and the lingering issue of Egyptian independence. Several powerful satraps in Asia Minor, emboldened by the relative leniency and advanced age of Artaxerxes II, had begun to act almost like independent rulers, forging their own alliances, raising their own armies, and often withholding tribute. Egypt, which had successfully thrown off Persian rule for over 60 years, remained a beacon of defiance, a constant reminder of the empire's incomplete dominion. Artaxerxes III recognized that if the Achaemenid Empire was to maintain its status as the world's preeminent power, these challenges to central authority had to be decisively and brutally crushed. His reign began with a swift and bloody purge of his own family and potential rivals, a chilling demonstration of his resolve. He reportedly executed many of his brothers and even his close relatives to eliminate any potential challenges to his throne, earning him a reputation for cruelty. This ruthless consolidation of power at the center was a clear signal to the satraps and rebellious provinces. The new king meant business, and he would tolerate no insubordination. It was a dark but effective way of sending a memo across an empire, ensuring everyone understood who was truly in charge. With his grip firmly secured on the heart of the empire, Artaxerxes III turned his formidable attention to reconquering the rebellious provinces and, crucially, Egypt. He launched a series of campaigns, personally leading his armies and displaying considerable military skill and strategic foresight. He systematically put down revolts in Phoenicia, Cyprus, and other parts of Asia Minor, ensuring that tribute flowed once again to Susa and Persepolis. His tactics were often uncompromising, leaving no doubt about the consequences of defiance. Cities that resisted were often severely punished, their leaders executed, and their populations enslaved, serving as grim examples to others. The crowning achievement of Artaxerxes III's reign was the successful reconquest of Egypt in 343 BCE. This was no easy feat. Egypt had for decades successfully repelled Persian attempts, often with the aid of Greek mercenaries and the strategic advantage of the Nile Delta's intricate geography. Artaxerxes III, however, learned from past failures. He amassed a truly massive invasion force comprising not only Persian troops, but also a significant contingent of Greek mercenaries, whose numbers likely dwarfed those employed by Cyrus the Younger. He meticulously planned the campaign, ensuring superior logistics and overwhelming numbers. The campaign was swift and decisive. The Egyptian pharaoh Nectanebo II was ultimately overwhelmed by the sheer force and organization of the Persian attack. Memphis, the Egyptian capital, fell, and with it, the last vestiges of independent pharaonic rule. Artaxerxes III did not hesitate to impose harsh measures to ensure Egypt's loyalty. Temples were reportedly plundered, sacred animals killed, and the land was brought firmly back under Persian control, transformed into a heavily garrisoned satrapy. This victory was a monumental triumph for the Persian Empire, restoring its prestige and bringing immense wealth back into the imperial treasury. It also eliminated a critical point of weakness on the empire's western flank, a thorn in Persia's side for over half a century. Beyond military conquests, Artaxerxes III also continued the internal reforms designed to strengthen royal authority. He clamped down on corruption among provincial governors, appointed loyal administrators, and ensured that the satrapies were functioning efficiently and sending their full tribute to the central government. This focus on fiscal discipline and administrative integrity ensured that the empire's vast resources were effectively harnessed, rebuilding the treasury that had been somewhat depleted by the constant internal and external conflicts of his father's later years. He was not just a general. He was a stern accountant for the entire empire. However, despite his successes in reconsolidating the empire, Artaxerxes III's reign also coincided with the rapid and alarming rise of a new power on the western fringes of the Persian world, the Kingdom of Macedon. Under the brilliant and ambitious leadership of Philip II, Macedon was transforming from a rugged, peripheral kingdom into a formidable military and political force, modernizing its army with the revolutionary Sarissa phalanx and skillfully expanding its influence over the Greek city-states. While Artaxerxes III was busy reconquering Egypt and putting down internal rebellions, Philip II was steadily consolidating his power in Greece, eventually defeating the combined forces of Athens and Thebes at the Battle of Chaeronea in 338 BCE, effectively becoming the master of Greece. Artaxerxes III, aware of the growing Macedonian threat, began to prepare for a confrontation, likely funneling resources and diplomatic efforts to counter Philip's expansion. However, before he could fully address this looming challenge, his reign came to an abrupt and mysterious end. In 338 BCE, Artaxerxes III was assassinated, reportedly poisoned by his eunuch minister Bagoas, who then placed Artaxerxes' youngest son, Arses, on the throne as a puppet king. This sudden and violent end to such a strong and effective ruler plunged the empire once more into a dangerous period of instability and intrigue, precisely at the moment when a unified and resolute Persian response was most desperately needed against the gathering storm from the west. The empire, seemingly at its strongest under Artaxerxes III, was about to face its ultimate test with a weakened and uncertain hand at the helm. The sudden and violent death of Artaxerxes III, arguably one of the most effective later Achaemenid kings, at the hands of his trusted vizier, the eunuch Bagoas, plunged the Persian Empire into a state of profound political instability at the most inopportune moment. This wasn't just a change of leadership. It was a deliberate and cynical manipulation of the throne, a desperate gamble by a powerful courtier to retain his own influence, utterly disregarding the looming external threats. Bagoas, having orchestrated the murder of Artaxerxes III and most of his sons, placed the youngest surviving prince, Arses, on the throne as a mere puppet king, hoping to rule through him. This brief and tragic reign, lasting only 2 years, 338-336 BCE, served as little more than a placeholder, a testament to the dangers of unchecked ambition within the royal court. Imagine a grand opera, and the conductor is suddenly replaced by a stagehand who thinks he can read the score. Arses, who took the regnal name Artaxerxes IV, quickly proved to be just as much of a figurehead as Bagoas intended, utterly powerless to stem the tide of internal decay or address the rapidly escalating threat from the west. Bagoas, intoxicated by his own power, continued his murderous spree, eventually assassinating Arses as well, when the young king showed signs of asserting his own will. At this point, the entire Achaemenid royal line seemed on the verge of extinction, manipulated and murdered by a ruthless courtier. It was a dark chapter, illustrating how even the strongest imperial systems can be undermined by internal rot and the insatiable lust for power by those close to the throne. Desperate to maintain a veneer of legitimacy, Bagoas then elevated a distant cousin of the royal family, a man named Codomanus, to the throne. This new king, who took the name Darius III, reigned from 336 to 330 BCE, and he was chosen precisely because Bagoas believed he would be easily controllable, perhaps due to his relative obscurity and lack of a strong power base. However, Bagoas soon discovered he had gravely miscalculated. Darius III, though brought to power by the eunuch's machinations, proved to be a man of considerable personal courage and a formidable will. He quickly asserted his independence and, in a remarkably swift and decisive act, managed to turn the tables on his supposed puppet master, forcing Bagoas to drink the very poison he had used to eliminate the previous kings. This act, while brutal, signaled that Darius III was not to be trifled with. He was a king who intended to rule, not be ruled. He walked into a snake pit and came out holding the snakes, which is pretty impressive, if you ask me. Darius III inherited an empire that, despite the efforts of Artaxerxes III to reconsolidate, was still suffering from the recent instability and the lingering effects of earlier revolts. More critically, he inherited the immense and increasingly urgent problem of Macedon, which by 336 BCE had transformed into the dominant power in Greece. Under Philip II, Macedon had not only forged a formidable professional army, characterized by the devastating Sarissa phalanx and integrated cavalry, but had also unified the Greek city-states, excluding Sparta, under its hegemony through the League of Corinth. Philip's ultimate ambition, long whispered in Greek circles, was to lead a pan-Hellenic invasion of the Persian Empire, ostensibly to liberate the Greek cities of Asia Minor and avenge the Persian Wars. This was no longer just a border skirmish. It was an existential threat. Just as Darius III was consolidating his power and beginning to assess the Macedonian threat, Philip II was assassinated in 336 BCE. This seemingly miraculous reprieve for Persia, however, was short-lived. Philip's successor was his brilliant and intensely ambitious son, Alexander III, known to history as Alexander the Great. Alexander, even at the young age of 20, immediately demonstrated a strategic genius and a thirst for glory that far surpassed his father's. After swiftly crushing a few rebellious Greek cities and reasserting Macedonian dominance, Alexander declared his intention to fulfill his father's dream, the invasion of Persia. Darius III, therefore, found himself in an unenviable position. He had barely secured his throne, purged the court of a manipulative vizier, and now faced the greatest military genius of the ancient world at the head of a highly motivated and experienced army. His empire was vast, its resources immense, and its imperial army counted hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of men. But its leadership had been fractured, its morale potentially undermined by decades of internal squabbles and the growing reputation of the Macedonian fighting machine. The previous Persian kings had successfully managed the Greek problem through diplomacy, money, and occasional military intervention. But Alexander was different. He was not interested in playing politics or accepting gold. He was interested in conquest, in total victory, and in forging an empire of his own. Darius III, to his credit, was no coward. He immediately began organizing the vast resources of his empire to meet the impending threat. Messengers were dispatched to every satrapy, summoning troops, requisitioning supplies, and preparing for a conflict of unprecedented scale. He understood the gravity of the situation, recognizing that the very survival of the Achaemenid Empire rested on his shoulders. The ancient world held its breath, knowing that two titans were about to collide in a confrontation that would irrevocably alter the course of history, determining whether the grand legacy of Cyrus the Great would endure or fall before the relentless charge of a young Macedonian king. The long-anticipated clash between the titans of the East and West finally commenced in 334 BCE, as Alexander the Great, having secured his grip on Greece, led his relatively modest but supremely disciplined Macedonian and Greek forces across the Hellespont, deliberately landing near the ruins of ancient Troy, a symbolic act for a man who saw himself as a new Achilles, embarking on an epic campaign. This was no mere raid. This was an invasion of unprecedented audacity, aiming at the heart of the vast Persian Empire, a realm that dwarfed Macedon in every conceivable metric: population, wealth, and sheer territorial expanse. Darius III, still consolidating his power and trying to rally the empire's vast resources after years of internal turmoil, now faced the ultimate test. And the opening rounds of this epic struggle would set a grim precedent for the Achaemenid defense. Alexander's strategy was bold and uncompromising: to strike swiftly, secure a foothold in Asia Minor, and decisively defeat any Persian forces he encountered, thereby demonstrating the superiority of his Hellenic forces and shaking the confidence of the empire. The Persian response, initially, was to confront Alexander with their local satrapal forces, rather than committing the entire imperial army immediately. This was perhaps a tactical error, underestimating the Macedonian threat, or perhaps a reflection of the difficulty in quickly mobilizing such a massive, diverse army from across the empire's vastness. The first major confrontation would come just a few weeks after Alexander's landing. The first significant test of arms occurred at the Battle of the Granicus River in May 303 BCE. The Persian forces in Asia Minor, led by a coalition of satraps, including Arsites, the satrap of Phrygia, and Spithridates, the satrap of Lydia and Ionia, along with a substantial contingent of Greek mercenaries, chose to make their stand on the eastern bank of the Granicus River, a relatively small but swift-flowing river. Their strategy was to utilize the river as a natural defensive barrier, hoping to decimate Alexander's forces as they attempted a crossing. This seemed like a sound tactical decision, giving them a strong defensive position. However, Alexander, with his characteristic audacity and tactical genius, did not hesitate. Despite the advice of some of his generals to wait until dawn, he ordered an immediate assault. Leading the charge himself, he plunged into the river, his heavy cavalry and hypaspists following close behind, directly engaging the Persian cavalry on the opposite bank. The battle was a chaotic and desperate melee in the riverbed and on the slippery banks. Alexander personally fought in the thickest of the fighting, narrowly escaping death multiple times and displaying extraordinary bravery, which further galvanized his troops. The Macedonian phalanx, though slower to cross, eventually joined the fray, their long sarissas creating an impenetrable wall of spears that overwhelmed the Persian infantry, including the formidable Greek mercenaries in Persian service. These mercenaries, caught between the Macedonian phalanx and cavalry, were largely cut down, offering little quarter. The Battle of Granicus was a decisive victory for Alexander. The Persian satrapal forces were shattered, and many of their commanders were killed. This victory immediately opened up Asia Minor to Alexander's advance, providing him with vital resources and securing a critical base of operations. More importantly, it sent a powerful psychological message. The legendary Persian cavalry was not invincible, and Alexander's army was a force unlike any the Persians had encountered. It was like watching a boxing match, where the underdog lands a knockout punch in the first round. Following Granicus, Alexander proceeded to systematically secure the coastal cities of Asia Minor, preventing the powerful Persian fleet from operating effectively against his supply lines. He liberated the Greek cities in Ionia, fulfilling the stated purpose of his invasion and gaining widespread support from the local Greek populations, who welcomed him as a liberator from Persian rule. Cities like Miletus and Halicarnassus offered spirited resistance, requiring Alexander to conduct difficult sieges, demonstrating that the Persians, when well fortified, could still put up a tough fight. At Halicarnassus, in particular, the Persian commander Memnon of Rhodes, a highly skilled Greek mercenary general in Persian service, put up a fierce and prolonged defense, showcasing the potential of combined Greek and Persian tactics. Memnon was perhaps the only Persian commander at this early stage who truly grasped the nature of the threat Alexander posed. The death of Memnon of Rhodes in 333 BCE, however, was a significant blow to the Persian defense strategy. Memnon had advocated a scorched earth policy to deny Alexander supplies and draw him deeper into the empire, as well as a naval counterattack in the Aegean to cut his supply lines and stir up trouble in Greece. With his death, Darius III lost his most capable commander in the western satrapies, and a coherent Persian defensive strategy evaporated. Replaced by a more reactive approach, Alexander's relentless advance continued, pushing eastward through Anatolia, his army growing in confidence and experience with each victory. He was not just conquering territory. He was effectively dismantling the long-established Persian administrative and military presence in the region. The satraps who had opposed him were dead or in retreat, their forces scattered. The wealth of these regions now flowed into Alexander's coffers, funding his continued campaign. The stage was now set for the direct confrontation between Alexander and the great king himself, a clash that would determine the fate of not just the Achaemenid Empire, but the entire known world. The young Macedonian general was about to meet the King of Kings, and the world held its breath. After consolidating his hold on Asia Minor, Alexander the Great pressed eastward, his ambitions soaring beyond mere liberation of Greek cities. He was now on a collision course with Darius III, the great king of Persia, a direct confrontation that would decide the fate of their respective empires. The logistical challenges were immense, stretching Alexander's supply lines to their breaking point. But his relentless drive propelled his army forward, deeper into the vast and ancient heartland of the Persian dominion. Darius, for his part, was assembling the full might of his imperial army, drawing contingents from every satrapy, determined to crush the audacious Macedonian invader and restore the Achaemenid prestige that had been so severely bruised. The first direct encounter between Alexander and Darius III occurred at the Battle of Issus in November 333 BCE. This wasn't the vast open plain Darius might have preferred for his immense army. Instead, the battle took place in the narrow coastal plain near the town of Issus, in what is now southern Turkey, nestled between the Amanus Mountains and the Mediterranean Sea. Darius, having initially marched south to cut off Alexander's presumed line of retreat, had inadvertently maneuvered his vast forces into a confined space that nullified his overwhelming numerical superiority. It was a classic example of a larger force being hampered by its own size in constricted terrain, like trying to fit an elephant into a phone booth. Alexander, realizing the strategic advantage offered by the narrow battlefield, advanced swiftly. He deployed his famed Macedonian phalanx in the center, a bristling hedge of long sarissas, with his elite companion cavalry on the right flank, personally led by him, and Thessalian cavalry on the left. Darius, meanwhile, had placed his finest Persian infantry, including his Greek mercenaries, in the center, hoping they could withstand the Macedonian charge, with his vast cavalry wings attempting to outflank the smaller Macedonian army. The battle began with a fierce clash. The Macedonian phalanx, despite facing stiff resistance from the Greek mercenaries in the Persian center, slowly but inexorably pushed forward. However, the decisive moment came on Alexander's right flank. Leading his companion cavalry, Alexander launched a ferocious charge directly at the Persian left, shattering their lines and driving a wedge into Darius's command. This wasn't just a military maneuver. It was a psychological attack aimed directly at the heart of the Persian command structure. Darius III, commanding from his war chariot in the center, found himself in mortal danger as Alexander's charge rapidly approached. The sight of the Macedonian king leading his cavalry with such ferocity must have been utterly terrifying, faced with the imminent collapse of his center and the direct threat to his person. Darius III made the fateful decision to flee the battlefield. This act, while perhaps understandable from a purely survivalist perspective, was catastrophic for Persian morale. The great king's flight signaled the immediate collapse of his army's cohesion. His elite troops, including his royal bodyguard, abandoned their positions and joined the general rout, desperately trying to escape the pursuing Macedonians. The battle quickly devolved into a massacre, as the smaller, more disciplined Macedonian army relentlessly pursued the fleeing Persians through the narrow plain, inflicting immense casualties. The sheer number of Persians meant that the pathways became clogged with terrified, retreating soldiers, making them easy targets. The spoils of victory were immense. Alexander captured Darius's elaborate war chariot, his bow, and most symbolically, his entire royal encampment, including Darius's mother, wife, and children. The Macedonian king reportedly treated Darius's family with utmost respect and courtesy, a shrewd political move that contrasted sharply with the typical brutality of ancient warfare and further enhanced his image as a just conqueror. It also sent a clear message to Darius. Your family is in my hands, and your empire is crumbling. The victory at Issus was a monumental triumph for Alexander. It confirmed his military genius, proved the superiority of his combined arms tactics, and demonstrated that even the great king himself could be defeated and forced to flee. It effectively broke the back of direct Persian resistance in Asia Minor and the Levant. However, Darius III was still alive, and he still commanded immense resources and the loyalty of much of his vast empire. The war was far from over. Following Issus, Alexander did not immediately pursue Darius into the Persian heartland. Instead, he systematically secured the Mediterranean coast, conquering Phoenicia and its crucial naval bases, most notably the prolonged and arduous siege of Tyre, 332 BCE. Tyre, a heavily fortified island city, resisted for 7 months, forcing Alexander to construct a massive causeway to reach it, a feat of engineering that demonstrated his unwavering resolve and resourcefulness. This siege, along with the subsequent capture of Gaza, ensured that the powerful Persian fleet, largely composed of Phoenician and Cypriot ships, could no longer threaten his supply lines or transport Persian reinforcements to Greece. It also denied Persia access to the sea, crippling their naval power permanently. This wasn't just about eliminating a threat. It was about cutting off an arm of the Persian Empire. Alexander then proceeded to conquer Egypt in 330 BCE, which surprisingly offered little resistance. The Egyptians, weary of Persian rule and impressed by Alexander's reputation, welcomed him as a liberator. He founded the city of Alexandria at the mouth of the Nile, which would become one of the greatest centers of Hellenistic culture and trade for centuries. In Egypt, Alexander visited the Oracle of Amun at Siwa Oasis, where he was reportedly confirmed as a son of Zeus, further bolstering his divine legitimacy and charisma in the eyes of his Macedonian and Greek followers. While Alexander was solidifying his control over the western portions of the Persian Empire, Darius III was desperately trying to regroup. He sent envoys to Alexander, offering a peace treaty that included a massive ransom for his family, cession of all lands west of the Euphrates, and even a marriage alliance. This was a significant offer, acknowledging the depth of Persian losses. However, Alexander, now convinced of his divine mission and the vulnerability of the Persian Empire, famously rejected these terms, declaring that the world could not have two masters. He was not interested in half measures. He wanted total victory, the complete overthrow of the Achaemenid dynasty, and the inheritance of the entire Persian Empire. The stage was now set for the final decisive confrontation that would determine the fate of the Persian Empire. A showdown in the heart of Mesopotamia, with the western satrapies firmly under his control and the Mediterranean secured. Alexander the Great prepared for the final decisive confrontation with Darius III. The rejection of Darius's generous peace terms left no doubt. Alexander aimed for nothing less than the complete conquest of the Achaemenid Empire. This would be a battle unlike any before, fought on a scale that dwarfed all previous engagements, a climactic showdown in the heartland of Mesopotamia that would determine the ultimate fate of two empires and reshape the ancient world. Darius, having learned from the debacle at Issus, sought to choose a battlefield that would maximize his numerical advantage and allow his vast army to deploy effectively. The chosen ground for this ultimate clash was a vast, flat plain near the village of Gaugamela, not far from the ancient Assyrian capital of Nineveh. and roughly 70 miles from modern-day Mosul in Iraq. Darius had meticulously prepared the battlefield, clearing and leveling the ground to facilitate the movement of his scythed chariots and his immense cavalry forces. He had even, according to some accounts, planted stakes to impede Alexander's cavalry charge. He commanded an army of staggering proportions, drawing on every remaining resource of his empire. Hundreds of thousands of infantry, tens of thousands of cavalry, archers, slingers, even 15 war elephants, though they saw limited action, and a large contingent of terrifying scythed chariots designed to cut swathes through enemy lines. The numbers, though often exaggerated in ancient sources, were undoubtedly overwhelming for Alexander's force, perhaps 5 or even 10 times larger. It was an assembly of forces that would make any modern military strategist scratch their head and say, "Now that's a lot of people." Alexander, after a grueling march across the Tigris River, arrived at Gaugamela in October 331 BCE. His army, while smaller, was a hardened, cohesive, and supremely confident fighting machine, honed by years of continuous campaigning and led by the greatest military mind of its era. He rested his troops for several days, meticulously scouting the Persian dispositions and devising a daring battle plan that leveraged the discipline and training of his Macedonian phalanx and the unparalleled shock tactics of his companion cavalry. He famously rejected the advice of some of his generals to attack at night, preferring a decisive victory in broad daylight, a testament to his confidence and tactical foresight. The Battle of Gaugamela began at dawn. Darius deployed his army in a vast line, with his scythed chariots placed in front to break the Macedonian lines, followed by his heavy infantry and numerous cavalry wings. Alexander, however, employed an audacious and brilliant maneuver. He advanced his forces obliquely to the right, drawing the Persian cavalry on Darius's left flank wider and wider, creating a gap in the Persian center. This was a classic Alexandrian tactic, creating a weakness in the enemy's formation through seemingly risky movements. Simultaneously, he had prepared a second line of infantry to deal with any attempted Persian encirclement, demonstrating his foresight in anticipating flanking maneuvers. As the battle commenced, Darius unleashed his scythed chariots. But the Macedonian anti-chariot tactics, which involved opening up lanes in the phalanx to let the chariots pass through harmlessly while pelting their drivers with javelins, largely neutralized their effectiveness. Meanwhile, on the wings, intense cavalry engagements raged. The decisive moment came when Alexander, having successfully drawn the Persian left flank away, saw the gap in the Persian center directly in front of Darius's position. He seized the moment, leading his elite companion cavalry in a thunderous wedge-shaped charge directly into this opening, striking at the heart of the Persian command. This was the famous wedge formation, designed to punch through enemy lines and disrupt their leadership. The charge was devastating. The Persian center, consisting of some of their finest units but ill-prepared for such a direct assault on their command, began to crumble under the shock of Alexander's personal leadership and the relentless pressure of his cavalry and hypaspists. Darius III, once again finding himself in immediate personal peril, witnessed the disintegration of his elite forces around him. Faced with the unstoppable momentum of Alexander's charge and the collapsing morale of his troops, Darius III again abandoned the battlefield, fleeing in his chariot, a decision that would forever seal the fate of the Achaemenid Empire. His flight, though perhaps an attempt to rally forces elsewhere, effectively signaled the end of the Persian resistance on this crucial day. With the great king in flight, the vast Persian army, lacking centralized command and a coherent strategy, dissolved into a chaotic rout. Alexander, despite the temptation to pursue Darius immediately, turned back to assist his beleaguered left wing, which was under heavy pressure from the more successful Persian right flank. Once that was secured, the pursuit of the fleeing Persians began, leading to a relentless chase that continued for miles. The battlefield was littered with Persian dead, and the spoils of victory were immense, including Darius's personal belongings, his royal treasury, and priceless artifacts. Gaugamela was not just a victory, it was the absolute and unequivocal end of the Achaemenid Empire as a major political entity. While pockets of resistance would persist, and Alexander would continue his march eastward, this battle effectively broke the back of Persian imperial power. Alexander now controlled Mesopotamia, the heart of the empire, along with the vast treasures of Babylon, Susa, and Persepolis, which would fall to him in the months that followed. Darius III became a fugitive king, desperately trying to raise a new army in the eastern satrapies, but his authority was now severely undermined. The ancient prophecy that a great empire would fall if a certain king crossed a river might have referred to Croesus and Lydia, but in a very real sense, Gaugamela saw a new great empire fall. Alexander's relentless pursuit of Darius continued into Media and then Parthia. Eventually, in 330 BCE, Darius III was betrayed and murdered by his own satrap, Bessus, who then proclaimed himself Artaxerxes IV. This act, intended by Bessus to perhaps gain favor with Alexander or to establish his own independent rule, ironically allowed Alexander to claim the moral high ground as the avenger of Darius, the legitimate successor to the Achaemenid throne rather than a mere conqueror. With Darius III dead, the final obstacle to Alexander's complete dominion over the Persian Empire was removed. The ancient empire that had stretched from Egypt to India, built by Cyrus the Great, reformed by Darius I, and restored by Artaxerxes III, had finally crumbled, falling before the unstoppable force of Alexander's ambition and military genius. A new era, one of Hellenistic influence and a unified super-empire, was about to begin. The death of Darius III in 330 BCE, betrayed and murdered by his own satrap Bessus, marked the definitive end of the Achaemenid dynasty that had ruled Persia for over 2 centuries. Yet, this was not the end of Persia in a broader sense, nor was it the beginning of a unified, stable, and singular Alexandrian empire that would last. Instead, Alexander's sudden and triumphant sweep across the former Persian dominion ushered in a complex and volatile period, defined by the imposition of Hellenistic culture, the continued integration of Persian traditions, and, crucially, the tumultuous rise of the Diadochi, the successors who would eventually tear Alexander's vast but hastily constructed empire apart. It was like building a magnificent house in a day, only for the builders to immediately start arguing over who owned which room. Alexander, now undisputed master of the former Achaemenid Empire, embarked on a deliberate policy of integrating Persian customs and personnel into his administration, aiming to create a hybrid Greco-Persian ruling class. He adopted Persian royal dress, began to demand proskynesis, ritual prostration, from his subjects, a practice that deeply offended his Macedonian veterans, and encouraged his soldiers to marry Persian women, famously leading by example with a mass marriage at Susa in 324 BCE. He appointed Persian nobles to administrative positions, sometimes even as satraps, alongside his own Macedonian generals. This policy, though strategically astute for governing a vast and culturally diverse empire, was met with considerable resistance and resentment from his Macedonian veterans, who saw it as a betrayal of their Greek identity and a blurring of the lines between conqueror and conquered. They had fought to defeat the Persian king, not to become like him, and these tensions would fester. Alexander's relentless campaigns continued eastward, into territories the Achaemenids had controlled, like Bactria and Sogdiana, and then into India. These grueling campaigns, lasting for several more years, further stretched his forces and pushed them to their limits. He established numerous cities named Alexandria throughout his empire, serving as military garrisons, administrative centers, and conduits for Hellenistic culture. These cities, populated by Greek and Macedonian veterans, merchants, and colonists, became crucibles of cultural fusion, spreading Greek language, architecture, and political ideas across the former Persian lands. It was an ambitious, if perhaps overly optimistic, attempt to Hellenize an entire continent. However, Alexander's dream of a unified Greco-Persian Empire under his sole rule was destined to be short-lived. His sudden and unexpected death in Babylon in 323 BCE, at the young age of 32, left a monumental power vacuum and no clear successor. He reportedly bequeathed his empire to the strongest, a chilling prophecy that immediately sparked decades of brutal warfare among his most prominent generals, the Diadochi. These were seasoned commanders, loyal to Alexander, but fiercely ambitious, each believing they were best suited to inherit portions of his vast domain. It was less a peaceful transition and more a free-for-all for the biggest prize in history. The immediate aftermath of Alexander's death was a period of frantic maneuvering and shifting alliances among the Diadochi. Initially, attempts were made to maintain the empire's unity, with Alexander's half-brother, Philip III Aridaeus, and his posthumously born son, Alexander IV, recognized as titular kings. However, real power lay with the generals who carved out spheres of influence, each jockeying for greater control. Perdiccas initially served as regent, but his authority was quickly challenged. Over the next 4 decades, through a series of brutal wars known as the Wars of the Diadochi, Alexander's empire was irrevocably fragmented. Major figures like Ptolemy secured Egypt, establishing the Ptolemaic dynasty that would rule there for nearly 3 centuries. Antigonus Monophthalmus, the one-eyed, attempted to unite the entire empire under his rule, but was ultimately defeated. And crucially, for the former Persian heartland, Seleucus IV Nicator, the victorious, emerged as the dominant power in the east. Seleucus, one of Alexander's most trusted generals, gradually consolidated his control over Mesopotamia, Syria, Anatolia, and vast swaths of the former eastern Persian satrapies, stretching as far as India. He founded the Seleucid Empire, the largest of the Hellenistic successor kingdoms, inheriting the vast majority of the former Achaemenid lands. His empire, a truly immense domain, blended Greek and Persian elements, with Greek being the language of administration and military, while local Persian and Mesopotamian cultures continued to flourish beneath the Hellenistic veneer. New cities like Antioch and the new Seleucia on the Tigris were founded as centers of Hellenistic power and trade, strategically placed to exert control over fertile lands and trade routes. The Seleucid Empire represented a new phase in Persian history. While ruled by a Greek dynasty, it was built upon the administrative foundations laid by the Achaemenids, adapting many of their satrapal structures and economic systems. The vast wealth of Mesopotamia and the Iranian plateau continued to flow into the imperial coffers, now supporting a Hellenistic court and Greek armies. However, the Seleucid Empire was constantly challenged by its sheer size, the vast distances involved, and the inherent difficulties of governing such a diverse population with a relatively small Greek ruling class. Rebellions from local populations, ambitious satraps, and challenges from other Hellenistic kingdoms were a constant feature of Seleucid rule. The legacy of Alexander's conquest was therefore paradoxical for Persia. It shattered the Achaemenid Empire, ending its direct line of rule, but it also introduced Hellenistic culture and political models that would deeply influence the region for centuries. The fragmentation into successor states meant that for a time, a unified Persian identity was submerged under various Hellenistic rulers, only to re-emerge powerfully with the rise of a new indigenous Persian empire in centuries to come. The era of the Diadochi ensured that the political landscape of the Near East would remain fractured and contested, a volatile mix of Greek ambition and enduring local cultures, laying the groundwork for the next great Persian resurgence. The establishment of the Seleucid Empire by Seleucus I Nicator marked a new chapter for the lands that had once formed the heart of the Achaemenid dominion. For a time, it seemed as though the entire Near East would be permanently Hellenized, governed by Greek kings and infused with Greek culture. However, the Seleucid Empire, vast as it was, faced an inherent instability stemming from its immense size, the constant pressure from rival Hellenistic kingdoms to its west, Ptolemaic Egypt and Antigonid Macedon, and crucially, the simmering discontent and persistent cultural identity of the indigenous peoples within its sprawling eastern territories. This internal pressure, combined with external threats, would eventually lead to the rise of a new power from the Iranian plateau, one that would reclaim a truly Persian identity and challenge Hellenistic dominance. The Parthian Empire. The Seleucid kings focused on their western borders and the strategic importance of Syria and Mesopotamia, often struggled to maintain firm control over their eastern satrapies, particularly those in modern-day Iran and Central Asia. These regions, with their deep-rooted Persian and Central Asian cultures, often chafed under Greek rule, viewing the Seleucid kings as foreign overlords despite their attempts at cultural integration. Communication and troop movements across such vast distances were slow and difficult, making it challenging for the Seleucid center to respond effectively to local rebellions or the incursions of nomadic tribes. It was like trying to manage a sprawling multinational corporation from a single distant office with slow internet and unreliable courier services. It was from this volatile eastern frontier that the Bani, a nomadic East Iranian tribe from the steppes of Central Asia, emerged as a formidable force. In the mid-3rd century BCE, under the leadership of Arsaces I, they began to raid and then settle in Parthia, a satrapy southeast of the Caspian Sea, previously under Seleucid control. The name Parthia itself was derived from the Old Persian Parthava, an ancient Achaemenid province, hinting at a return to indigenous roots. The Seleucid governor of Parthia, Andragoras, initially struggled to contain the Parni incursions, and eventually the region declared its independence, establishing the Arsacid dynasty, which would come to be known as the Parthian Empire. The early Parthian expansion was a slow but steady process, characterized by guerrilla warfare and strategic retreats against larger Seleucid armies. They adopted a unique military strategy, leveraging their superb mounted archers and cataphracts, heavily armored cavalry, to devastating effect. The mounted archers would harass and wear down enemy formations with volleys of arrows, performing the famous Parthian shot, shooting backward while retreating at full gallop. Once the enemy was softened, the cataphracts, armored from head to toe, would charge, a terrifying sight that could break even the most disciplined infantry. This combination was highly effective against the slower, phalanx-based armies of the Hellenistic world, giving them a distinct tactical advantage on the open plains of Iran. Imagine trying to catch a mosquito while being charged by a tank. That was the Parthian strategy. Over the next century, the Parthians gradually expanded their control, chipping away at the Seleucid Empire's eastern territories. By the mid-2nd century BCE, under kings like Mithridates III's c. 171–138 BCE, the Parthian Empire had become a major power. Mithridates I conquered Media, a vital region with ancient Achaemenid roots, and then seized Mesopotamia, including the twin capital cities of Seleucia on the Tigris and Babylon. This was a monumental achievement, placing the heart of the former Achaemenid Empire firmly under Parthian control, and effectively ending Seleucid dominance east of the Euphrates. The Seleucids, now reduced to a smaller kingdom primarily focused on Syria, were no longer the preeminent power in the Near East. The rise of the Parthian Empire represented a significant resurgence of Iranian power and culture. While they initially adopted some Hellenistic elements, particularly in their coinage and initial administrative practices, they increasingly emphasized their Iranian heritage. They saw themselves as the rightful heirs to the Achaemenid legacy, even if their origins were tribal rather than directly dynastic. This was a deliberate cultural and political statement, a rejection of foreign Hellenistic rule, and a reassertion of native Persian identity, setting the stage for centuries of Iranian self-determination. This newfound Parthian power soon brought them into direct conflict with another rising giant, the Roman Republic. Rome, having conquered the Hellenistic kingdoms in the west and solidified its control over the Mediterranean, began to expand eastward, inevitably colliding with the Parthian Empire over control of the rich lands of Syria, Armenia, and Mesopotamia. This began a centuries-long rivalry, a struggle for supremacy between two of the ancient world's most formidable empires. The first major clash occurred in 53 BCE at the Battle of Carrhae, where the Roman general Crassus, one of the wealthiest men in Rome, led a disastrous invasion of Parthia. The Parthian mounted archers and cataphracts annihilated Crassus's legions, inflicting one of the worst defeats in Roman history and capturing their legionary standards. A profound humiliation for Rome. Carrhae established the Parthians as a formidable military power that Rome could not easily defeat. The Parthians were not interested in territorial conquest on the Roman model. They were focused on maintaining control over their vast internal trade routes, particularly the Silk Road, which brought immense wealth from China and India. Their conflicts with Rome often revolved around the client kingdom of Armenia, which served as a perennial buffer state and a point of contention. Historians still argue whether the Parthian Empire was a loose confederation of feudal lords or a more centralized bureaucratic state. But its ability to repeatedly check Roman expansion speaks volumes about its effectiveness. The Parthian Empire, despite its feudal nature, managed to endure for nearly 5 centuries, c. 247 BCE, 224 CE, a remarkable longevity. It became a powerful bridge between East and West, facilitating trade and cultural exchange, while fiercely defending its independence against Roman aggression. It demonstrated that a decentralized, Iranian-based empire could stand toe-to-toe with the greatest Western power, proving that the spirit of Persian imperial ambition had merely slumbered during the Hellenistic interlude, waiting for the right moment to reawaken. However, like all great powers, the Parthian Empire too would eventually face its own internal struggles and external pressures, setting the stage for yet another, even more magnificent, Persian resurgence. The long reign of the Parthian Empire, spanning nearly 5 centuries, was a testament to its adaptive military strategies and its success in maintaining control over the vital trade routes linking East and West, effectively holding the line against Roman expansion. Yet despite its enduring presence and formidable power, the Parthian state was characterized by a more decentralized, almost feudal structure compared to the highly centralized Achaemenid or even Roman empires. Its strength lay in a confederation of powerful noble families, each commanding their own retinues and territories, bound together by loyalty to the Arsacid king, but often prone to internal feuding and rebellion, especially during periods of weak central authority. It was like a very large, powerful, but sometimes fractious family business. This inherent decentralization, while providing resilience against external shocks by allowing local lords to defend their own territories, also bred internal weaknesses. Succession disputes were common and often bloody, allowing ambitious regional governors to gain significant power, sometimes at the expense of the Arsacid monarchy. Constant warfare with Rome, though often ending in Roman defeats, was nonetheless draining on resources and manpower. Furthermore, the very success of the Parthians in defending their borders meant that they perhaps became less adaptable to new threats or internal shifts in power. It was from within the historical heartland of Persia, the province of Parsa, modern Fars, the ancient Achaemenid homeland, that a new, dynamic force began to emerge in the early 3rd century CE, one that would not only overthrow the Parthians, but also usher in a truly magnificent rebirth of Persian imperial power and culture, the Sasanian Empire. This was not merely another dynastic change. It was a revolution, a conscious effort to restore the glory of the Achaemenids and reassert a distinctly Iranian identity and religious purity. It was as if the ancient spirit of Cyrus and Darius had been waiting patiently for the right moment to reawaken. The founder of this new dynasty was Ardashir the Firm, a local ruler of a small kingdom within Parsa. Ardashir claimed descent from a legendary Persian hero and began to consolidate his power, defeating rival local princes and steadily expanding his territory. His rise was fueled by a fervent embrace of Zoroastrianism, the ancient Persian religion, which had arguably waned somewhat in official emphasis under the more tolerant Parthians. Ardashir presented himself not just as a conqueror, but as a divinely appointed restorer of the true faith, a champion against perceived religious laxity and Hellenistic influences. This religious zeal provided a powerful ideological underpinning for his nascent empire, uniting his followers with a shared sense of purpose and divine mission. It was a potent combination of military might and spiritual conviction. Ardashir's ambitions soon brought him into direct conflict with the Parthian Arsacid dynasty. The reigning Parthian king, Artabanus IV, initially dismissed Ardashir as a minor regional nuisance. However, Ardashir proved to be a military genius, employing well-drilled infantry and heavy cavalry, often drawing on a deeper reservoir of loyal, ethnically Persian troops. The decisive clash came at the Battle of Hormozgan in 224 CE. Ardashir's forces decisively defeated the Parthians, and Artabanus IV himself was killed in battle. This was a complete and utter victory, marking the end of the Arsacid dynasty and the beginning of the Sasanian era. The overthrow of the Parthians by the Sasanians was more than a change of ruling family. It was a profound cultural and political shift. The Sasanians were fierce proponents of centralization and a powerful, religiously sanctioned monarchy, in stark contrast to the more decentralized Parthian system. They embarked on an ambitious program of state building, consciously drawing inspiration from the Achaemenids, even if their direct knowledge of the distant past was sometimes based on myth and legend. They saw themselves as the rightful heirs to the imperial legacy of Cyrus and Darius, aiming to restore Persia to its former glory. Under Ardashir III and his immediate successors, particularly his son Shapur-Tufan, the Sasanian Empire rapidly expanded and consolidated its power. Shapur-Tufan, who reigned from 240 to 270 CE, was an equally formidable military leader and an astute administrator. He continued his father's work of centralizing the state, codifying laws, promoting Zoroastrianism as the state religion, and investing in infrastructure. He also inherited the ongoing rivalry with Rome, which now faced a renewed, more aggressive, and more centralized Persian adversary. Shapur-Tufan's reign saw some of the most spectacular Persian military successes against the Roman Empire. He launched multiple invasions of Roman territory, seizing vast swathes of Mesopotamia and Syria. His most famous triumph occurred at the Battle of Edessa in 260 CE, where he decisively defeated a Roman army and incredibly captured the Roman Emperor Valerian alive. This was an unprecedented humiliation for Rome, the first time a Roman emperor had been captured by a foreign foe, and it was a monumental propaganda victory for the Sasanians, proudly depicted on rock reliefs at Nakshi Rustam. It sent a clear message. Rome was no longer dealing with the loose Parthian confederacy, but with a resurgent, powerful, and utterly confident Persian Empire. The Sasanian Empire, from its very inception, projected an image of divine legitimacy and imperial grandeur. Its kings, known as Shahanshah, King of Kings, claimed direct descent from legendary Iranian heroes and ruled with an unprecedented degree of authority, buttressed by a powerful Zoroastrian clergy and a sophisticated bureaucracy. This period would witness a true flourishing of Persian art, architecture, literature, and science, creating a new golden age that would rival and in many ways surpass the glories of the Achaemenids, cementing the Sasanian Empire as one of the great powers of late antiquity. The ascendancy of the Sasanian Empire marked not just a change in dynasty, but a profound cultural and political renaissance for Persia, a deliberate and often fervent return to what was perceived as a purer, more ancient Iranian identity, heavily intertwined with the re-establishment of Zoroastrianism as the state religion. This wasn't merely a political preference. It was a deeply ingrained aspect of Sasanian imperial ideology, viewing the Shahanshah, King of Kings, as divinely appointed, a protector of the faith, and a unifier of the Iranian lands. This newfound cohesion and centralized authority propelled the Sasanian Empire into a period of remarkable artistic, scientific, and administrative achievement, earning it a place as one of the great superpowers of late antiquity, often standing as the equal and often fierce rival of the Byzantine Empire. You could say they were the dynamic duo of the ancient world, perpetually locked in a cosmic wrestling match. The Sasanian kings, from Ardashir the Firm to Shapur Form and their successors, systematically built upon the foundations laid by the Achaemenids, but with their own distinct innovations. They meticulously organized their bureaucracy, centralizing power and ensuring efficient tax collection. They invested heavily in infrastructure, constructing roads, bridges, and irrigation systems that boosted agricultural productivity and facilitated trade. The vast network of trade routes, particularly the Silk Road, brought immense wealth into the Sasanian coffers, making their court at Ctesiphon, their primary capital in Mesopotamia, a dazzling center of luxury and cosmopolitanism. Imagine a modern-day financial hub, but with more elephants and elaborate gold-embroidered robes. Art and architecture flourished under Sasanian patronage. Monumental rock reliefs depicting royal triumphs and religious scenes were carved into cliffs, echoing the Achaemenid tradition, but with a distinctive Sasanian flair. Magnificent palaces, characterized by their soaring iwans, vaulted halls open on one side, intricate stucco work, and vibrant frescoes dotted the landscape, showcasing the empire's wealth and sophisticated craftsmanship. Sasanian metalwork, particularly silver plates and bowls adorned with intricate hunting scenes and royal portraits, became highly prized across Eurasia, influencing artistic styles as far away as China. This wasn't just decoration, it was propaganda, projecting an image of power, divine favor, and unparalleled refinement. Beyond artistic endeavors, Sasanian Persia became a beacon of intellectual activity. Scholars from various traditions, including Greek, Indian, and Syrian, converged in centers like the famous academy at Gundishapur, which became a hub for medicine, astronomy, and philosophy. Persian scholars translated and preserved numerous classical texts, contributing significantly to the transmission of knowledge that would later fuel the Islamic Golden Age. Mathematics, particularly in areas like trigonometry and algebra, saw significant advancements, and the Sasanian postal system, reminiscent of the Achaemenid royal road, was a marvel of efficiency, demonstrating their mastery of logistics. However, this golden age was also defined by almost incessant warfare with their great rival to the west, the Roman Empire, which, after the division of 395 CE, became the Byzantine Empire. The borderlands between these two empires, particularly Armenia and Mesopotamia, were a perpetual battleground, a strategic chessboard where proxy wars, diplomatic maneuvering, and devastating full-scale invasions were a constant feature of the landscape, Both empires saw themselves as the rightful inheritors of ancient universal rule, divinely ordained to dominate the world, making compromise a rare commodity. The conflicts were driven by a complex mix of geopolitical interests, religious differences, Zoroastrian Persia versus Christian Byzantium, and economic competition. Sasanian kings like Shapur II, reigned 309–379 CE, were particularly aggressive and successful against Rome, waging prolonged wars, regaining lost territories in Mesopotamia, and inflicting significant defeats on Roman armies. Shapur II, who became king at birth, or even before, depending on the story, famously led his armies personally, a military genius who restored Sasanian prestige after a brief period of Roman advances. He was the kind of baby who probably came out of the womb already planning military campaigns. Later Sasanian rulers, such as Khosrow Thamum Anushirvan of the Immortal Soul, who reigned from 531 to 579 CE, represented the zenith of Sasanian power and influence. Khosrow Thamum was not only a formidable military commander who launched successful campaigns against Byzantium, extending Sasanian control deep into Syria and even temporarily seizing Antioch, but also a philosopher king, deeply interested in justice, administration, and intellectual pursuits. His reign is often considered the true golden age of Sasanian Persia, a period of unparalleled prosperity and cultural flourishing. He codified laws, reformed the tax system, fostered education, and encouraged religious tolerance, though Zoroastrianism remained supreme, making his court a magnet for scholars from all over the world. The long and arduous series of Sasanian-Byzantine wars were incredibly costly for both empires, draining their treasuries, exhausting their manpower, and leaving their borderlands devastated. These wars often involved vast armies, sophisticated siege warfare, and prolonged campaigns. While the Sasanians achieved significant successes, particularly under Khosrow and later Khosrow II, these victories often came at an immense price. The constant cycle of conflict, of capture and recapture of cities like Dara and Nisibis, and the shifting control over buffer states like Armenia and Lazica created a state of perpetual tension and exhaustion. This prolonged rivalry, while showcasing the strength and resilience of both empires, would ultimately leave them vulnerable to a new, unforeseen force emerging from the Arabian Peninsula, a force that would sweep across the region with astonishing speed and irrevocably alter the course of history for both the Sasanian and Byzantine empires. The centuries-long rivalry between the Sasanian Empire and the Byzantine Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire, escalated dramatically in the early 7th century CE, reaching a climax that would, ironically, leave both imperial giants utterly exhausted and vulnerable to a new, unforeseen power. This wasn't merely a series of border skirmishes. These were full-blown existential conflicts, driven by deep-seated historical animosities, religious differences, and a relentless competition for regional hegemony, resembling two worn-out heavyweights in the final rounds of a grueling match, too tired to truly win, but too stubborn to surrender. The seeds of this final devastating series of wars were sown during the reign of the Sasanian Shahanshah Khosrow II Parvez, the Victorious, who ruled from 590 to 628 CE. Khosrow, an ambitious and initially successful monarch, was deeply entangled in Byzantine internal politics. He had been briefly ousted from his throne by a rebellion, and restored with the crucial military aid of the Byzantine Emperor Maurice. This alliance, however, proved fragile. When Maurice was overthrown and brutally murdered by a usurper named Phocas in 602 CE, Khosrow II seized the opportunity, declaring himself the avenger of Maurice and launching a massive invasion of Byzantine territory. This was more than just a military campaign. It was framed as a holy war, a righteous crusade to punish the regicides and reclaim lands that Khosrow felt were rightfully his. The initial phase of this final Sasanian-Byzantine War, 602-628 CE, was an astonishing string of Persian successes. The Sasanian armies, revitalized and led by capable generals, swept through the Byzantine East with breathtaking speed. They systematically conquered Syria, including the ancient city of Antioch, and then turned their attention to the Levant, capturing Jerusalem in 614 CE. The fall of Jerusalem was a particularly shocking blow to the Christian Byzantine world, compounded by the Sasanians carrying off the true cross, one of Christianity's holiest relics, to Ctesiphon. It was a moment of profound humiliation for Constantinople, a clear sign that the Persian juggernaut was, for a time, unstoppable. The Persian conquest continued, extending into Egypt, which fell to Sasanian forces in 619 CE, effectively restoring the Achaemenid and early Sasanian borders. For a brief, glorious period, the Sasanian Empire stretched from Anatolia to Egypt, recreating a territorial empire that rivaled the scale of Darius the Great and Khosrow I. Persian armies even reached the shores of the Bosphorus within sight of Constantinople itself, threatening the very heart of the Byzantine Empire. This was the pinnacle of Sasanian power, a moment of triumph that must have felt like a divine vindication of their imperial ambitions and their Zoroastrian faith. Imagine the euphoria in Ctesiphon, believing they were finally restoring Persia to its rightful place as the sole universal empire. However, this overextension and the immense cost of these prolonged campaigns would ultimately prove to be the undoing of the Sasanian Empire. The Byzantine Empire, under the brilliant and tenacious leadership of Emperor Heraclius, reigned 610-641 CE, launched a desperate and daring counteroffensive. Heraclius, a military genius, completely revamped the Byzantine army, focusing on mobile, disciplined forces. He initiated a series of audacious campaigns, bypassing the heavily fortified Persian lines and striking deep into the Persian heartland, even reaching the gates of Ctesiphon. He leveraged diplomacy, securing alliances with nomadic tribes like the Khazars, who attacked Persia from the north. The tide of the war turned decisively in favor of Byzantium. Heraclius recaptured lost territories, inflicted major defeats on Sasanian armies, and in a dramatic reversal of fortunes, restored the true cross to Jerusalem. The war culminated in the Battle of Nineveh in 627 CE, where Heraclius's forces utterly routed the main Sasanian army. This crushing defeat, combined with the continuous drain of resources and manpower, led to a palace coup against Khosrow II, the long-reigning Shahanshah, who had brought his empire to such dizzying heights, was overthrown and brutally murdered by his own son Kavad II, bringing an end to his ambitious yet ultimately catastrophic reign. The period immediately following Khosrow II's death was one of extreme chaos and instability for the Sasanian Empire. A rapid succession of short-lived rulers, assassinations, and civil strife tore the empire apart from within. The treasury was empty, the military exhausted and demoralized, and the central government was in disarray. The empire, though territorially restored by Heraclius to its pre-war borders, was a mere shadow of its former self, weakened by years of relentless warfare and internal power struggles. It was like a magnificent ancient tree, having weathered countless storms, now finally hollowed out from within and battered by the last greatest tempest. Meanwhile, the Byzantine Empire, though victorious, was also utterly exhausted. Its territories had been devastated, its population depleted, and its economy ruined by decades of warfare. Both empires, the two great powers of their age, lay prostrate, mutually assured destruction, achieved not through nuclear bombs, but through ceaseless conventional warfare. This collective exhaustion, a kind of imperial fatigue syndrome, would create an unprecedented power vacuum in the Near East, a vacuum that would be swiftly and decisively filled by an entirely new and unexpected force emerging from the deserts of Arabia, bringing with it a new religion and a new imperial vision that would sweep away the old order with astonishing speed. The stage was tragically set for the final act of the Sasanian Empire, the utter exhaustion of both the Sasanian and Byzantine empires, after decades of brutal, resource-draining warfare, created a geopolitical vacuum in the Near East, a moment of profound weakness that would prove irresistible to a new dynamic force emerging from the Arabian Peninsula. This was not a power arising from traditional imperial centers or long-established agricultural lands, but from the nomadic tribes of Arabia, unified by a new religion, Islam. The speed and scale of the Islamic conquests, beginning in the early 7th century CE, were unprecedented, sweeping across the weakened Sasanian Empire with terrifying efficiency, and irrevocably altering the course of Persian history forever. It was like two aging, weary boxers collapsing in the ring, only for a fresh, agile martial artist to step in and claim the championship. The Prophet Muhammad had, by the time of his death in 632 CE, unified the diverse tribes of Arabia under the banner of Islam, forging a powerful, religiously zealous, and militarily effective community. His successors, the Rashidun Caliphs, immediately embarked on a series of expansionist campaigns, driven by a combination of religious fervor, the promise of spoils, and the inherent military prowess of the Bedouin warriors, now disciplined and united under a common cause. Their initial targets were the rich lands of the Levant and Mesopotamia, territories held by the weary Byzantines and Sasanians. The first major engagements for the Sasanians against the nascent Islamic forces were nothing short of catastrophic. The heavily armored Sasanian cavalry, accustomed to fighting the more conventional armies of Byzantium, found themselves ill-suited to the swift, hit-and-run tactics of the mobile Arab cavalry and infantry. The Arabs, hardened by desert life, possessed incredible endurance and a fierce, unshakable morale. Moreover, the Sasanian imperial army, once the pride of the empire, was demoralized by decades of war, weakened by internal strife, and possibly suffering from a crisis of leadership following the tumultuous reigns after Khosrow II. The decisive blow to the Sasanian Empire came at the Battle of Al-Qadisiyah, fought in 636 CE, though the exact date is debated. This was a multi-day engagement near the city of Al-Qadisiyah in present-day Iraq, and it pitted the main Sasanian army, commanded by the celebrated general Rostam Farrokhzad, against the forces of the Rashidun Caliphate, led by Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas. The Sasanian forces were immense, including war elephants, a terrifying sight to their enemies. However, the Arab tactics, combined with the difficult terrain and perhaps a dust storm that disoriented the Sasanian forces, proved superior. Rostam himself was killed, a devastating blow to Sasanian morale and leadership. The defeat was crushing, opening the floodgates to the heartland of the Sasanian Empire. The legendary Sasanian military, which had stood toe-to-toe with Rome for centuries, was irrevocably broken. Following Al-Qadisiyah, the Arab armies swiftly advanced. They captured Ctesiphon, the magnificent Sasanian capital, renowned for its wealth, and the monumental arch of Tak-Kasra. The plunder of Ctesiphon was immense, providing the nascent caliphate with unprecedented riches and resources, further fueling their expansion. The fall of the capital was not just a military victory. It was a symbolic blow that signaled the end of an era. The treasures, which had been accumulated over centuries of Sasanian prosperity, were now distributed among the Muslim warriors, effectively transferring the wealth of a great empire into the hands of a new power. The last Sasanian Shahanshah, Yazdgerd III, a young and ultimately tragic figure, attempted to rally the remaining forces of his empire. He fled eastward, desperately seeking to raise new armies from the distant provinces. But his efforts were constantly thwarted by the relentless Arab pursuit and the growing fragmentation of his own dwindling authority. The final, ultimate defeat for the Sasanian Empire came at the Battle of Nahawand in 642 CE. This battle, sometimes referred to as the Victory of Victories by the Arabs, completely shattered the last organized resistance of the Sasanian state. Yazdgerd III became a king without a kingdom, constantly on the run, seeking refuge wherever he could find it. For the next decade, Yazdgerd III continued his desperate flight, trying to appeal to local magnates and even the Chinese Tang dynasty for aid, but to no avail. He was pursued across the Iranian plateau, a ghost of his former imperial glory, in 651 CE. While seeking refuge in Merv, in what is now Turkmenistan, he was murdered by a local mill owner, probably at the instigation of a disgruntled satrap, or for mere plunder. With his death, the direct line of the Sasanian kings came to an end, and with it, the independent political existence of the last great pre-Islamic Persian Empire. The 1,000-year unbroken chain of Persian imperial rule, from Cyrus the Great to Yazdgerd III, was finally broken. The Islamic conquest of Persia was remarkably swift, especially when compared to the centuries of struggle between the Persians and Romans. Within 2 decades, the vast Sasanian Empire, once the epitome of centralized power and cultural brilliance, had been utterly absorbed into the burgeoning Islamic Caliphate. This conquest was not just political. It was profoundly transformative on a cultural and religious level. While Persian culture, language, and identity would endure, they would now exist within the framework of a new Islamic empire. The magnificent temples of Zoroastrianism would gradually give way to mosques, and the Pahlavi script would slowly be replaced by Arabic. However, the deep roots of Persian civilization would prove remarkably resilient, adapting and contributing significantly to the new Islamic Golden Age, ensuring that the legacy of Persia, though transformed, would continue to shape the world. The fall of the Sasanian Empire to the swift and decisive thrust of the Islamic Caliphate in the mid-7th century c marked the end of an extraordinary era of independent Persian imperial rule, a lineage stretching back over a millennium to Cyrus the Great. Yet to simply say the end would be to miss the enduring, multifaceted legacy of Persian empires, a profound and pervasive influence that continued to shape the Islamic world, and indeed the broader tapestry of global civilization for centuries to come, proving that even when a political entity crumbles, its cultural spirit can persist and even flourish in new forms. It's like a grand river that changes course. The water still flows, just through different channels. One of the most immediate and profound legacies was in the realm of administration and governance. The Achaemenids, and later the Sasanians, had perfected sophisticated systems of imperial management. The satrapy system, efficient taxation, elaborate road networks, standardized coinage, and a professional bureaucracy. The early Islamic caliphates, particularly the Umayyads and later the Abbasids, found these established Persian administrative structures incredibly useful, adapting and adopting many of them to govern their own vast and rapidly expanding empire. Persian scribes, administrators, and financial experts, with their centuries of experience, became indispensable to the new Islamic rulers, providing the practical know-how to run such a sprawling domain. The Diwan, or government bureau, for instance, a cornerstone of Islamic administration, was largely a continuation and evolution of Sasanian fiscal and administrative departments. Beyond practical governance, Persian culture exercised an immense and transformative influence on the Islamic Golden Age. While Arabic became the language of religion and scholarship, the Persian language, Farsi, with its rich poetic and literary tradition, not only survived but thrived, adapting the Arabic script and producing some of the world's most enduring poetry, like the works of Rumi, Hafez, and Ferdowsi, whose Shahnameh, Book of Kings, meticulously preserved ancient Persian myths and history. This literary renaissance deeply impacted Arabic literature and intellectual thought. The grand Persian tradition of courtly etiquette, philosophical discourse, and scientific inquiry became intertwined with Islamic learning, contributing significantly to advancements in mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy within the Abbasid Caliphate. Cities like Baghdad, the Abbasid capital, were built with Persian architectural influences and populated by a large and influential Persian intelligentsia, effectively becoming centers of Perso-Islamic culture. Religiously, while Islam became the dominant faith, the legacy of Zoroastrianism and other ancient Iranian beliefs subtly influenced some aspects of Islamic thought and mysticism, particularly Sufism. While the political power of the Zoroastrian clergy waned, communities of Zoroastrians continued to exist, preserving their ancient traditions and contributing to the diverse religious landscape of the broader Persianate world. Militarily, the Achaemenid and Sasanian traditions of organized warfare, heavy cavalry, and siegecraft left their mark. While the early Islamic armies relied on their own formidable tactics, they later incorporated and adapted Persian military technologies and organizational methods. The cataphracts, those heavily armored Sasanian cavalry, influenced the development of armored cavalry across Eurasia, including in the Byzantine Empire and later European knighthood. Perhaps one of the most enduring, if intangible, legacies is the very concept of kingship and empire that permeated Persian thought. The idea of the Shahanshah, the divinely ordained King of Kings, who ruled a universal empire with justice and order, profoundly influenced the Islamic caliphs and later Islamic dynasties, who adopted many of the ceremonial aspects, court rituals, and even the language of Persian imperial legitimacy. The Abbasid caliphs, in particular, consciously emulated Sasanian imperial grandeur, moving their capital closer to the former Sasanian heartland and embracing a more autocratic, divinely sanctioned model of rule. This was a clear departure from the earlier, more egalitarian style of the Rashidun caliphs, illustrating the seductive power of ancient Persian precedents. It's like your old history teacher whispering in the ear of new generations, imparting lessons you didn't even know you were learning. The administrative divisions and infrastructure developed by the Persian empires also had a lasting impact. The network of roads, irrigation systems, and trade routes continued to facilitate commerce and communication under Islamic rule, helping to integrate the vast new empire. The cities established by the Achaemenids and Sasanians, from Persepolis, though ruined, to Ctesiphon and beyond, continued to serve as important centers, or their legacies inspired new urban developments. Even the memory of the Persian empires continued to inspire. Figures like Cyrus the Great, Darius I, and the legendary Sasanian kings became part of the broader Islamic historical narrative, admired for their wisdom, justice, and imperial achievements, often serving as exemplars of good governance. The resilience of Persian identity, despite centuries of foreign rule, Greek, then Arab, eventually led to the emergence of powerful, culturally Persianate dynasties within the Islamic world, such as the Samanids, Ghaznavids, and later the Safavids, who re-established independent Persian states, albeit under the banner of Islam. These dynasties consciously invoked the pre-Islamic Persian past, drawing on its artistic and literary heritage, demonstrating that the spirit of Persia, though transformed, was far from extinguished. In essence, the Persian empires, through their sophisticated administrative models, rich cultural contributions, and enduring concepts of governance, provided a foundational framework upon which much of the subsequent Islamic civilization was built. Their story is not one of absolute disappearance, but of metamorphosis, a testament to the powerful influence a civilization can exert even after its political structures have collapsed. The echoes of Cyrus, Darius, and the Shahanshahs continue to resonate through the corridors of power and the flourishing intellectual centers of the Islamic world, proving that true legacy transcends mere conquest. It's been quite a journey, hasn't it? From the dusty plains where nomadic tribes first dreamed of greatness, through the monumental conquests of Cyrus, the administrative genius of Darius, the epic clashes with the Greeks, and the centuries of rivalry with Rome. We've seen empires rise and fall, leaders triumph and despair, and cultures blend and reshape under the relentless march of time. Now, as the soft glow of the screen begins to dim, and the stories of kings and warriors fade into the quiet stillness of your room, allow these ancient tales to gently settle, like fine desert sand. Let the echoes of distant battles and the whispers of forgotten courts dissolve into the comfort of the night, leaving behind only the peaceful rhythm of your own breath. The grand tapestry of history is always there, waiting to be explored anew when you awaken.